Karen will do
Oh,
that.
Karen's on? Okay. Hi, Karen. Welcome this morning.
Hi, good morning, sir. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you this morning, but I will go ahead and try and get all the activities done that I would normally do in person through this interface. And so to call the roll for the State Shooting Complex Oversight Task Force for November 17th. Senator Cole.
Present.
Thank you. Representative Ottman.
Present.
Mr. Corsi, I believe, is excused.
Excused.
Thank you. Mr. Davidson.
Present.
Mr. Maestas.
Present.
Representing the State Parks and Cultural Resources.
Dave Glenn, present.
Thank you. Representing Wyoming Game and Fish.
Eric Woltinger, present.
Representing Wyoming Business Council.
Ron Goldberg, present.
Is there a representative for the Wyoming Office of Tourism?
I don't see anyone.
Thank you. Co-Chairman Hicks.
Here.
Co-Chairman Washut.
Here.
You have a quorum.
Did you call Miss Legursky?
Oh, I'm very sorry. I did miss her. Representing Shooting Sports.
Present.
Thank you. My apologies.
Thank you. So just out of curiosity, I'm kind of interested who's all in the room. And for those of you who are willing, would you start from the front row and work towards the back? If you just stand and speak nice and loud and let us know who you are and why you're interested in the shooting complex.
Cody, long time competitive shooter, testifier. Lloyd Teal, Park County Commissioner.
Second row. Let's start over here.
PJ House, CEO of the Chamber of Commerce. Our 500 business members are the best location in the state for complex.
Morning, Kristen Fong with Wyoming Business Council. Part of Park County and the entire big Park Bay Center.
I'm James Preston, CEO of the facilitating on that task force. John Holland with RC Power Sports. We operate Polaris and Honda dealership in basically.
And Representative Adam Angelos from House District 3, which is in Trumbull County. And Conduit is also looking to
Richard Seward, County Commissioner. Joel Heiss at Fremont County, vice chair, co-chair of the Fremont County shooting. What we're looking at Fremont County in some of those cases, mayor of Shoshone, and just like to say, you guys are doing a great job this putting this together. It'll be a benefit to any place that they want. John Schwartz for the shooting complex. Bill Scott, Big County, for the window closed.
Welcome to our town. And I have to echo the sentiments from these districts over here. What do you think of our community and
Now we go down the line for the task force. I'm starting on this end. Everybody can introduce yourselves to the audience and who you represent.
Cade Mastis from the manufacturing representative side with Maven Optics in Lander.
Aaron Davidson, same manufacturing representative for Gunworks here in Cody.
Pepper Ottman, House District 34, which encompasses Du Bois, Pavilion, part of Riverton, eastern part of Lander, Jeffrey City, and points in between.
John Kolb, State Senate, Senate District 12, which is almost wholly in the city of Rock Springs.
Larry Hicks, Senate District 11, which is all of Carbon County and about a third of Sweetwater County. It's the largest center district in the lowest 48 as far as land mass. And in my district, there's more antelope than there is people.
And they don't vote.
If I knew what party affiliation it was, I'd be inclined to maybe consider it.
I'm Art Washut, representative of House District 36, which is entirely in the city of Casper.
Judy Ligursky, longtime civilian marksmanship program board member, CEO and chairman for 15 years, recently retired. Huge supporter of competitive shooting. The CMP built a $27 million range 7 years ago. We didn't pay for the range, but it does meet its expenses from month to month. Looking forward to having a quality range here in Wyoming.
Good morning, Dave Glenn. I'm the Acting Director of State Parks and Cultural Resources.
Good morning, Ron Goldberg, Strategic Partnerships Director for the Wyoming Business Council.
Good morning, Eric Woltinger, Chief of Services, Wyoming Game and Fish, representing Game and Fish and sports people of Wyoming.
And the missing seats, we have a representative from Muley Fanatics, and we have a representative from tourism normally with us today. So that makes up your task force, and it's the burden's on us to come up with a system that will work, that's fair, that gives everybody a good, fair chance. There's a lot of interest out there across the state. Yet everybody recognizes what a great plum this would be to land this shooting complex in your community. So as Senator Hicks said at our first meeting, the game is on. And the contest is underway, and folks are giving this a lot of great thought about what their communities might bring to the table. So we put out on Monday the original letter of interest criteria, and those are open till March 1st, I believe, Karen, is that right? March 1st? Yes, so you can submit those letters of interest with your original proposal up till March 1st. And then those early proposals will not put anybody in or cut anybody out. The only purpose for those is to see who's interested and to make sure that those who submit letters of interest are aware of the scope of the project that we're anticipating. And the next thing that we've asked at our last meeting was to kind of get an overview of some of the major rangers around the United States and how they're managed and what their governance structure is. That's an issue that's yet to be decided. And I think on the letters of interest, we've asked you all to let us know what governance structure you would be most comfortable with. Would you see this as a state-owned property run by the county government and county employees, or some other approach? But before we get too far, Karen, do we have anybody on Zoom that I didn't have introduce themselves? I just realized I may have cut out part of our audience here.
Mr. Chairman, yes, we do have two people on Zoom, Nephi Colt and Philip Vallejo, if you'd like for them to introduce themselves.
Please.
Good morning. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm Nephi Cole. I'm the Director of Government Relations and State Affairs for the National Shooting Sports Foundation, and would have been with you, but had to travel to Minnesota. I got back pretty late from that on an airplane, and looking forward to hearing the discussion and being a technical assistance, if I can, to answer questions about the industry's needs and a little bit about shooting sports. And then Mr. Vallejo, I invited him. He'll introduce himself also, but he is one of the recognized finest shooters in the world, and he's here to listen in on the discussion and also act as a technical expert.
Thank you. Welcome, Nephi. So, Mr. Guerrero's not on yet, is that? Okay. So let's move to governance structures. Karen, can you kind of give us an overview of what you learned about the governance structures?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy to. Karen Vaughn, LSO, Legislative Editor and Associate Fiscal Analyst. Obviously, there are more recreational facilities than there are regional or national facilities. In looking at recreational facilities, I discovered that at least 18 states have developed grant programs that assist with establishing new ranges or improving existing ranges. And primarily those tend to correlate with their hunter safety education. And so a lot of times there is a requirement for that facility to have hunter safety education and have proof of that before in many states you can obtain your hunting license. Ranging in those types of grant programs, some of them are up to 90% funding by the state. Some are a 4-to-1 match. Of course, you can imagine there's a lot of different variances. One thing that I did notice in many of those states is that the match could not be federal funds. It had to be raised by the applicant directly. Those states that did not have a specific grant program tended to take a direct ownership or direct involvement in those types of facilities in their state. An additional 23 states, either directly or through partnerships with federal government, local governments, private businesses, gun clubs, rod clubs, NGO organizations, that type of thing. Those facilities, very interesting. They ranged anywhere from an unstaffed, I don't want to say side of the road, but in some cases it's just a very primitive location. And they went all the way up to your private gun clubs, private and public clubs. But in each of these situations, whether it was a grant program or whether it was a direct involvement, most of these types of facilities were much smaller than I think what the task force is contemplating. And they generally served 1 or 2 disciplines and were not really of the size and scope that I think the task force is looking at. Looking at facilities that the chairman identified earlier in the year, which I believe the task force did receive a presentation on, plus some additional facilities that I was looking at, I've discovered that nationally recognized or facilities that typically host regional or national events don't have the direct involvement that the state has in those smaller shooting complexes. I found that where we have 40 of 50 states that are involved in the recreational and hunting facilities, most of the facilities that are at that level are more actively involved through non-government organizations, typically 501c organizations, whether it's C3, C4. There are 5 exceptions to that I found relatively regional. And in 4 of those situations, the state owned the land and it was either operated by a state agency or through a concessionaire. In one case, it was operated by a local government. And then, of course, you are all familiar with the Cameo site, which is actually owned by the local government, and it is operated by the state government. And in those situations, there are always a memorandum of understanding between the two parties. I did not find through the smaller government or with these facilities where a title to the land was held by more than one entity or by any type of powers board organization. It may be a federal government land, it may be state, local, private land, but I did not find anything where there was two or more parties that were directly related to the ownership of the property. One interesting facility that is regional to us is the Cheyenne Mountain facility, just outside of Colorado Springs. It's one of two facilities that I found that was on federal land. But what's interesting about it is through a memorandum of understanding, they have not only the Federal Department of Army, they also have El Paso County, they have the Sheriff's Department, and they also have the state parks and wildlife all involved in that facility. And it's probably the most complicated organizational structure because it does have so many different entities involved. As far as looking at Wyoming's structure for a shooting facility, we could follow a lot of the other states' formats and envelop that within a state agency. For example, Game and Fish or Parks. That's what a lot of states that have taken ownership of the land have done. And when that is not desired, there are two different other organizations that readily come to mind that are familiar in Wyoming structure. The first is a Joint Powers Board. Joint Powers Boards allow two non-state governments, so non-state agency entities to enter into an agreement to provide many different types of services, one of them being operating a recreational facility. However, those are generally geographically limited to the locations that the two entities or three or four, however many entities are involved in the board, have the authority to operate. So if I considered this a complex here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, for example, I would be looking at a Joint Powers Board probably that would encompass the city and the county, because both of those entities can operate here. If I were looking for something, you know, halfway between here and say Laramie, you might be able to have Albany County, Laramie County, and several different city governments between those, because they do have the authority to operate in one or more of those jurisdictions. They are just like any other county or agency or instrumentality, and they have the same authorities that that their members have. So if the county has authority to do XYZ, then that can also be extended to the Powers Board. A couple of drawbacks for a Powers Board is their membership is appointed by the governing parties of the participating agencies, and they are limited in their financing. Contributions can come from one or more of the agencies, bonds, revenue bonds, gifts, donations, grants of federal money, industrial project bonds, or by facilities that are owned or leased by the agencies when the title is going to vest with that entity at the end of the lease term. The other option that we can probably immediately think of is going to be a public corporation. We have two great examples of that. The first, of course, being the Wyoming Business Council. And the Wyoming Business Council is operated as a state agency. And it is, excuse me, but it is, and it's solely for public benefit. It is its duties are to encourage, stimulate, support the development and expansion of the economy in the state. And it does so through specific grant programs and other programs that it has been assigned via statute. It is exempt from the Wyoming Administrative Procedures Act, but it is subject to the Public Records Act, the Meetings Act, and it enjoys the immunity that a state agency would. Because it is operated as a state agency, it is funded through the legislative process. Another corporation that we can immediately see would be the Wyoming Lottery Corporation, which is also an instrumentality of the state. But it has been enabled with comprehensive and extensive powers that are generally exercised by corporations that are engaged in entrepreneurial pursuits. It's not operated as a state agency, and oversight of the corporation is provided through annual audits and submitted reports to the governor, Department of Audit, and the legislature. Different from the Wyoming Business Council, the state is not liable for liabilities, deficiencies, or debts of the Wyoming Lottery Corporation, and the full faith and credit of the state is not pledged to their debts. So you can see from a corporation standpoint, they do have the autonomy of governing and setting their own board of directors. But it is limited in that it would operate through the state government and county and other entities through memorandums of understanding instead of a joint powers board where both parties are at the table at the same time. And with that, I sit for questions.
Holy cow, I didn't realize there were that many options. What I'd like to do now, thank you. Any questions, committee, for Ms. Bond? Don't see any. Thank you very much for all that work and putting that together. I'd like to open it to public comment. If anyone in the room or on Zoom would like to comment specifically about government structure. I want to encourage everybody that we don't want to get ahead of ourselves with presentations about what you're anticipating your design, your location might be. But today we want to talk about governance structure and whether or not any of the communities that are interested have given that thought and have a preference. We do ask that you identify that in your initial letter of interest. But today, if anyone would like to come forward and share their thoughts about governance structure, preferred government structure, we'd like to hear from. So just come up one at a time, press the button until the light turns green, identify yourself for the record, and then briefly tell us what you'd like us to know.
Yeah, thanks. Scott Weber, Cody, longtime competitive shooter. I've done nothing but be a competitive shooter all my life. I've traveled from Maryland State Shoot to Reno. I have never married. I don't have any kids. I just shoot. And I had the great fortune, I was telling Judy, to be raised in Central Ohio, where I went to Camp Perry and spent 2 weeks there. And also at 40 minutes from my home was the Grand American Trap Shoot, which all my uncles shot at. And I went there from age 6 till they moved to Sparta, Illinois in 2005. I think I was calculating the other day, I spent 1.5 years on that range of my life. I'm 68, so that's a lot. In terms of governance, here's what we see across the country. If you take a place like Ben Avery, that's run by Arizona Game and Fish, and your partner is Game and Fish. I would suggest that Game and Fish run it. You're going to need, I think there's a misconception that you build it and people will just come and they'll bring their people in it and they'll shoot and put matches on, or nothing's further from the truth. You need range officers out there 100% during the day. One of the problems we've had with Cody is we don't have a range officer all the time. So people show up to elk hunt or whatever and, go out and spray paint dots on the rocks out there at 1,500 yards and start cranking at it, and they shoot up our racks and all kind of stuff. So the point I'm trying to make is someone needs to be on that range 24/7, and you have to have permanent people. All right. Now, the military run and CMP runs Camp Perry. The ATA, the organization, runs those ranges, those are organizations that run it. But think about this, you have to have a trap mechanic there all the time. If you're going to have 2 or 3 sporting clay courses or 4 or 5, I don't know what you want. You're going to need a trap mechanic out there. You're going to be working on like 35 to 50 to 150 traps. So what we see, even, well, Ben Avery is, that's run by Arizona Game and Fish, but many these big ranges and shooting complexes like we want here are run by their natural resources at 50-50, and we're 50-50 with Game and Fish, correct? So, well, it's a big affiliation, let's put it that way. So it would seem to me like they would be in on the running of it, but somebody has to be there all the time. There are grants for that. The way we handle it in the shooting, Cody shooting complexes, we have what we call saints out there, guys that live out there like Mike Snell and some of the other ones. They pretty much are there probably 10 hours a day in many cases. Well, guess what? He just retired in September. So volunteer will not work for this. But basically we're seeing the state running it.
Thank you. Questions? Very informative. Thank you very much. You have to write a book, My Life Shooting. Oh, good. Make sure the green button's on. State your name again for the record and tell us what you'd like us to know about governance.
Thank you very much. James Klesson, CEO and President of Forward Cody, and our local task force is divided into committees that are looking at different aspects that coincidentally match your pre-proposal. So it's been very good for us to hear what you've talked about. Karen, I think it was Karen, did a great job of discovering the things that we are working, my committee is working on, which is the governance structure. And I was very interested in hearing from the committee what the interest of the committee and the legislature is as far as how it would be owned and how it would be operated. I think the suggestion of having a state agency own it is good. I think that's obviously would be the panacea, because now you're not having to worry about local budgets. But one of the things I want to remind you is that when you have local investment, you have local ownership, you're going to have a higher propensity for success because we're vested in it. If it just happens for you and not because of you, it changes the dynamic of things. But I am very interested in hearing what your preferences could be. I think that Karen did articulate some things related to the business council, related to the lottery. We need to dig into those a little deeper. We had a little more of a joint powers board type structure in mind, but I'd be interested in maybe working more to understand what you guys are looking for. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know the committee has a single preference at this point, but I know that it was stated early on by the co-chairman that we certainly wanted the local groups to have skin in the game. Mr. Co-chairman?
Yeah, and again, I just want to go over, this process, because I think sometimes, and it's evolved as we done. So the bill that we passed through the legislature just set up the task force, and as a promise to the legislature, there was absolutely no foregone conclusion as to where it was going. It would be a competitive statewide process. And what we wanted to do is involve any of those entities, whether they be county, municipal, joint powers board, private sector contributions. We wanted to leave that to the maximum flexibility to see what those local groups, entities, how much do you want to put into the game? How much are you committed to the proposal? We've got a $10 million budget right now. That may not be all in the future, the idea is here, but to answer your question is the task force at this point in time is we want to hear from you, in the state of Wyoming and the vested partners out there is to come back and say, this is what would work best for us. So we don't have, the point I'm trying to get to, there was no preconceived notion is that it's going to absolutely be run by Game and Fish. It's absolutely going to be run by the county. It's absolutely going to be run because what we want to do is entertain the best opportunity for the state of Wyoming. And again, I still believe that sometimes these local decisions rather than tell you what we want, is to listen and say what works for you. And ultimately what will happen, and we're going to talk about some of the scoring system, and governance will be part of that. And part of that governance will be, what do you as a local entity bring as far as part of that governance structure? And so again, we're asking for you as to what works best. What works best for Campbell County may not be the best thing for Cody, may not be the best thing for Bighorn, may not be what Fremont County and those municipalities up there want, may not be best for corporate partners. So, you know, we certainly, if there was a proposal that had a strong corporate partnership in there, they probably need to be in some form of component into that governance structure. And that may be a 501c3 organization that oversees this. And so we don't have an answer to your question, and we're asking you the question, but it's something that we have to be able to come back to and say, this is how this facility would run if we go to this community. This is how this facility, and again, so we're trying to tailor this to your needs so you can bring the best and the strongest proposal back to the state. I think every one of these, what we see interests around the state is substantial. And rather than constrain any proposals, the idea is to maintain maximum flexibility. You come and tell us how you would propose to run the facility. And then all of that's on the table. Again, as much local input as possible into that process. I hope that helps, you know, answer the question. And as this thing evolves, we're going to have a little discussion today about how would we rank something like governance structure. You know, how do we rank different components of a proposal? You know, I think the co-chairman and I were visiting is, you know, what's the number one priority for a state shooting complex? Is it access? Is it the wow factor? You know, what are those components that are the most important to creating, you know, and a lot of that's going to come back to that local government's, that local input. I think that the very first meeting that we had and conversations with some of the ranges is the best range in the world with the best wow factor. If it's run poorly, is not going to be very successful. And so that's a very keen component that, you know, it's going to be it has to be a people operation. And we're cognizant of that, but again, as we go through this process, this is designed for us to say, these are issues that we're going to grapple with. We want your input back. This is going to be some community in the state of Wyoming. And I agree with that. And I think the task force has always agreed with that. The more local buy-in, the higher probability that it's success. So, and then you have to roll in the other components. You know, we want a high degree of educational opportunity with this facility, economic development. You know, those are things that are going to be, but again, we need you guys is to come back and say, within this range of things that we're looking at, so shooting, education, economic development, there's going to be all these criteria. Our role is to listen at this point in time and start to put the proposals together and then try to do a very objective ranking system, but it's supposed to be a dialogue. You know, and, you know, I think the very first thing we did is we put that survey out and said, what do the people of Wyoming want in a state shooting complex? And so I would go back to that. We had over 300 comments from 22 counties and 5 states. That's the kind of feedback that we need from you guys. So this is supposed to be a very interactive process. So again, as these things come up, don't hesitate to contact your local members or any member of this stuff. We're keeping track of this stuff, but that's the way this process was set up to begin with very foregone decisions and as much input and a dynamic process to get the best thing that we can for the state of Wyoming. So again, I would ask any of those other entities that are represented here today, you know, if you guys have contemplated a potential governance structure, what can we do to help provide? Do we need to give you a list? So Karen just went through a whole list of potential alternatives. So when we put this request for proposals out, it will say, here is a whole list. It's not all inclusive, but these are things: 501, joint powers board, private ownership, you know, county ownership, municipal ownership. I see some head nods. Yeah, you'd like that list put in there and say, these are things you need to consider on potential ways. So, I mean, right off the bat, that's something that we can do and include. So with that, Mr. Co-Chair, I turn it back to you or any members of the committee that have anything that they want to add to that.
Committee, anything? Mr. Goldberg?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I guess that was very well said. I would follow up, as you look at this, there's this holistic way to look at it. There's so many aspects from the hunter safety training to recreational sport shooting opportunities for Wyomingites. And we had a good discussion, some of us, especially with the private industry folks at dinner last night, and all the way to economic development, how this complex could be a starter for that cluster development of industry innovation. And, that kind of works with private industry. It's not forced, but how could you look at your thoughts, and each region and community can be a little different. How do you accomplish that holistic look of all and the total project costs? Getting a complex built is one thing, but operations, maintenance, staffing, the opportunity for tourism and hospitality growth, but also that private industry innovation where they kind of take a facility and they get innovative and creative, and industry builds around it. So I don't know if that helps or makes sense.
Very helpful. Thank you. Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to hit this another angle. Try to give you the maximum flexibility to make choices locally. Because there's one thing I've learned in my short time as being in governance is that you take away control off of local entities, and nobody likes that. So I realize it's chicken or the egg, what comes first, what do you want to do? This allows you the ultimate flexibility to craft a proposal the way you think fits your community. So it's probably, maybe, hopefully unique, hopefully it should be standard, but I think that's what's on the table. And I know folks want direction, but this is really up to you. I think there's a baseline of information you can use, but if you want to go out there and figure out a new partnership that wasn't contemplated, you're able to do that. So basically, it's hopefully a cooperative process moving forward, like was already spoken about. But I don't know if that helped, Mr. Chairman, but I wanted to throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you. I think when it comes to these sorts of things, the most efficient way is top down. This is what we need. You step up and do it, right? But that's rarely the most successful approach, but it is efficient. We would have an answer in 5 minutes, right? But that's not what we're looking for. We want, again, maximum flexibility to let you all come up with an approach that makes sense in your community so your proposal can be successful. So with that, is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to offer some comments about? Yes, please come forward. And we have somebody on Zoom as well? Okay. We'll go, here's the table, and then we'll go to Nephi on Zoom. Sir, would you turn the green light on, introduce yourself again, and tell us what you'd like to say about governance?
That put together north of town. I think you'd be impressed with what we did, and please come out and see us.
Yeah, I think several people will be taking you up on that offer. Yeah, and that's the whole key here, right? Is that the more we see what local agencies or local community members are able to achieve, we don't have to tell you how to do it. You're going to tell us what we can do and what we do really, really well in our community. So that's what we're looking for. Anyone else? Nephi, you got your hand up?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, thank you very much. I just wanted to share, I do think that, in my experience, having seen a number of these large facilities, that the partnership approach works very well with state agencies. And just a reminder for folks that are considering how to put this together, I don't know, we have an Office of Outdoor Recreation in the state of Wyoming, and the shooting sports actually make up about 20% of the outdoor recreation economy in the United States of America. It's significantly larger than people think. And so, there may be some opportunity there if there are challenges. Game and Fish always is, stretched for resources. That said, they're phenomenal partners when that's able to be used correctly for the Game and Fish Department. They also have a source of funding in the Pittman and Robertson funds. Of course, nationally, it's about $1 billion. In Wyoming, it's about $20 million a year. And a significant portion of that can be used for the maintenance and upkeep of ranges and facilities. And so I think it's about a quarter per year of that Pittman Robertson money that's paid to the state of Wyoming. That said, there's a process that's a little bit challenging for Game and Fish to go through in determining. They have to beforehand clearly articulate how they're going to spend that money when they receive that money from the Treasury. So there's a little bit to it there in working with them. So if somebody we're going to consider partnering with Game and Fish, that patience needs to be considered. And also the thought that it might require some additional legislative action in order to make sure that Game and Fish, a partnership with them, is steered in the right direction, and that the right type of flexibility is built for both use of funds and for also weighing in on how the facility is managed, used, things like that. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. And I'm certain that we would be happy to at least bring forward whatever legislative changes might be necessary to make that type of thing work. Anyone else want to talk about governance this morning? Anyone else on Zoom? Anyone else in the room? Kind of talk this one down. Okay, thank you. I'm going to close public comment. Committee, any comments from the committee on governance? Mr. Glenn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just trying to figure out the process. If a community is saying, we're going to partner with Game and Fish, or we're going to partner with state parks, are they then reaching out to those agencies and having discussions with them? What I would hate to do is for communities to focus a lot of energy saying, okay, Game and Fish is going to be our partner. Game and Fish is going to be our partner. We get down to deciding time, and Game and Fish says, the way this is structured is not going to work for us. So I'm just trying to wrestle with that in my head, and I just wanted to throw that out.
Mr. Co-Chairman.
Yes. So, Mr. Chairman, at this point in time, that would be premature to enter into any discussions with any agency. So the question would be is the conceptual development of a range would be, so, and I'm just going to run through there let's say the county may provide some resources for road access, maintenance, and all of that stuff. They would propose that the facility would be owned and operated by the state of Wyoming. That would be part of their governance structure. But the county's going to provide stuff. Maybe the city's going to purchase some land, or the county, or then they've got a corporate entity that says, well, we're willing to contribute this. So under that structure, they'd come back and say, getting back to, I think, what Nephi Cole says, we're going to form a partnership type of arrangement for the operation, maintenance, and governance of this facility. And then that would just be the proposal that they would come back, right? Because we don't know if that's going to happen at this point in time. They're just telling us this would be the most efficient for, say, Bighorn County or Park County or Forward Cody or whatever that entity is, could be but they're going to make a recommendation how they would prefer if they get awarded the facility, and then if we say, well, that governance structure looks like it works, they've got all the partnerships in place and stuff. This is not something I don't think that we will rank as much as we need to understand as how that fits into the proposal. And there may be financial contributions. I know there's at least one entity out there that says we own a lot of land. That's our contribution, but it's our land, so we still want to be part of that governance structure, but we don't want to do the day-to-day work out there. Getting back to range officers, they're not employed. We're not going to supply the employee. Well, they need to tell us how that arrangement would potentially work. And so that it would be part of the proposal, is to say, look, this is how we propose to own, operate, maintain, and develop this facility. It could be an economic development entity under a 501(c)(3). Does that answer your question? I would not encourage anybody to start saying, hey, Dave, State Parks is going to run this right now and we need an agreement with you. That's too mature. We just want the framework. Right. Does that make sense?
Mr.
to
Glenn?
Folks in the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And that's exactly where I was hoping you would go. I'm not ready to have conversations
No.
from a state park side. And I really like what you said about this partnering with the state. And then maybe it's the agency sitting down and discussing who's going to be the best for that. And obviously this group. So thank you.
Anyone else on the committee? Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to try to say it another way. Maybe it makes more sense to some people. So if we have a beginning to end proposal, connect the dots, connect all the dots, what you're proposing. From the conception to the end, all the pieces would come together in a cohesive line of events. So we're not, I think, saying, well, I don't really know what we're going to do here. And I guess you could say that as you were connecting the dots, but the proposal would have to be cohesive. So, you know, we're hearing that, you know, like, well, what do you want? And I guess we're saying on the one hand, it's up to you. Well, whatever it is you want to do, have a plan that works together as a line of thought that you could understand exactly where you're coming from and why you're doing or proposing what you're proposing. But to me, that would be helpful. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you. Anyone else on committee? Representative Altman.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. What I'll just say is kind of what I would need to hear if I was in your shoes. One is, what is the very best thing? If you could build anything in your community, what would it be? What would it look like? How would it be facilitated? Who would it serve? What is the potential? What are the stages it could grow? What does it look like? Because I believe with this mindset, we'll be successful and have the very best. If we're of a mindset, I have to beat out those people, wonder what they're doing, everybody's going to be a nervous wreck, and you're not going to know what you can do. What we need to do is work for the state. So what is the very best that you can do? And then we'll look at that as a group and we'll say, okay, what is the best for the state? So that's just my ideas.
Thank you, Representative Altman. Other committee members comment? Okay. I hope that we provided some guidance that's helpful for communities that are interested in this. No preset. We just want to know what works for you. And you're going to give us the ideal. And then when we get down to talking nuts and bolts, it might need to be modified a little bit. But that's where we're going. And I hope that's helpful for you as you put together your pre-proposals. Next on our agenda today is to talk about our letter of intent. Karen, we got that letter out. Josh, you have some update on that, and kind of give us an overview of where we're at with the letters of intent.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Josh Anderson, LSO. So yeah, as many of you know, and as the task force will remember, we met on Zoom on October 20th to kind of finalize what would be in kind of this letter of interest outline that would get posted to the website. And at that time, we kind of settled on the dates of, starting November 13th and ending March 1st, 2024. So that did go up on the website this last Monday, November 13th. And submissions can be submitted to our email address, which is shootingcomplex@wildedge.gov. I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but the task force kind of settled on these 6 categories, 6 kind of broad categories of what they're looking for information for these communities that would like to indicate their interest to the task force. So just the broad categories are the land where this would be located, access to the proposed facility, utilities in the area, dining and lodging, economic development. And then finally, kind of an other information category, which would include amenities, the wow factor that was mentioned earlier, proposed governments to the extent that's known, as we've discussed this morning, and then kind of a catch-all of any other additional information that the submitter would like to know. Of course, it's early, so we haven't received any submissions to this point. One question I would like the task force to kind of think about this morning and maybe give some direction on is when we get these, do you guys want to get them one by one? My thought was kind of, we could maybe give you, updates every couple of weeks on what we've gotten. Or if you want to wait till the end and see them all at once. So that's one question, if you guys have any direction, that would be great for us. But that's essentially where we are with that, Mr. Chairman. I'd take any questions.
Thank you, Josh. As far as announcing these letters of interest, it would be my sense, and I'm open to comments from others, that it might be to someone's advantage to see what their competitors have submitted before they submit their proposal. So my suggestion would be none of them get revealed until March 1st. And then on March 2nd, we open them all at once. They all get posted. They all get shared with the committee and we move forward. But rather than letting, one county put their proposal in and then somebody else sees what they proposed and try to one up them before they submit, then everybody waits till the last day to put their proposals in. So my sense would be kind of like we do with bids and so forth in local government, keep them all secure at the LSO and only release them when it's done. Does that make sense, committee?
Yeah, and so I just would ask each committee member to go around if that's okay, or if they have an alternate proposal. So, okay. Aaron?
Is there anything we can learn by seeing those before they're publicly released? Is there anything that can help us develop our direction? Because that's a long time between now and March 1st. I understand the public withholding, but is there anything that we could learn as a committee in the interim?
So what are you thinking? I'm asking you.
Well, it feels like the way we've set up this process is we're learning as we go. And to take away that information arbitrarily for 4 months, it would starving us of information that we can use to learn to help develop, our, future opinion about how we do want this proposal to be and how we are going to judge and rank. Could we accept those and have access to those and see those and keep them private, but discuss and share and develop, our ideas and our information before we release to the public.
So let me ask a question of our staff, Josh. So if these proposals are submitted, how do we retain confidentiality between the applicant, or it's not an application at this point in time, it's a letter of interest and saying these are things that we are looking for. How do we do that under the nature as a task force? And is it a public record that's available for inspection once it's submitted to LSO? So it's a legal question, right? So what's your thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, good question, Mr. Chairman, and I'll have to dig into that a little bit. Certainly, it wasn't going to be our intent to share these publicly until that closing date. I think, my thought was we would potentially be able to share them with the task force members, as was noted, and I kind of we had the thought of every few weeks give an update on what's there, and but again, I will certainly look into that question of can these, what would happen if there would be a public records request? But I think we could keep them private as far as, being this kind of ongoing proposal process. but I'll look into that, Mr. Chair.
And it just seems to me like once March first comes around and the deadline, then they are a public record. Because we're gonna be discussing those different proposals. And I agree with to a certain degree, because we still have to put together the final RFP. This is the request that you now have to supply all this information for. So I do think it would be to a certain degree helpful to see what's coming in, because I think it will help inform us as to how to tailor the RFP, which then we'll have a quicker turnaround time on our side versus having to get hit all at one time with how many proposals and sort through them, or letters of interest. We need to be clear on, this is a letter of interest that will help develop the RFP. So I would go ahead, Cade, and then I want to keep going around each one of them.
So a little bit of a concern on that side would be, depending on how far we get down the pathway of knowing what we want before we open those, there could be some bias in developing the RFP after we see everyone's proposal, that we're tailoring it to prejudge some of those that we've seen come in, like, oh, we're going to make this a very high score thing because my county has that in their proposal already. And I think there could be some risk of intentional or unintentional bias if we're too educated about what the communities want before we put our scoring matrix solidified.
But if we're going to have a letter of intent, what was the intent of that if we're not going to use it to develop the scoring matrix? Because otherwise we should just skip that process. We'll develop the scoring matrix in a vacuum and then put out the RFP.
Hopefully we will have that scoring matrix in place before the deadline on these. Hopefully. Yeah, and I mean, you guys have already, there's pros and cons. And so one of the things, and I'm just gonna be very blunt here, is I'm very cognizant of the fact, and we've had this discussion, I think, at every meeting, is the appearance. And so those folks that are sitting out there, this has got to, when this process will go. So we go through all this, develop the RFP. This task force's job is to make a recommendation back to the legislature and the governor where this facility is going to go. And for us four guys or gals that are in the legislature, we have to be absolutely above board that this was an objective process, because there is as you guys are sitting out there, there's a tremendous amount of interest in this. And so just dealing with a long term with a lot of different issues in the legislature, it's very easy for us to make a recommendation and then somebody to come out and say, well, it was biased because you had two people from Fremont County on there and that's why it's going there. And so pretty soon there's an amendment to move it to someplace else other than what the recommendation. So we have to be very upfront and forward. So I'm very cognizant of Cade, that we need to be able to pass the red face test, that there was absolutely no bias interjected into this process whatsoever. It was completely objective. Yeah. Well, for some of you, completely objective based on unbiased criteria. So we just need to always keep that in the back of our mind, because it does go back into the legislative process. And so there's pros and cons. I think we can probably do the same thing here before we get to March 1st. My recommendation would be have a couple of batching dates. So, instead of every time one of them comes in, just say, on this date, any proposals come in, they're distributed. Anyway, I want to go around and get other people's input on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to go along with my comment previously, this is for the people of Wyoming. And if we keep that in mind, I think that'll help. And to discuss just for a moment, the two ideas previous to me, would it be possible to put out a generic rather than specific letters, like so many counties have applied, these are the things that we're seeing, or to do it anonymously without the name of the county on it or whatever. I don't know. It's just a thought. But to wait till March is a long time. But as we see with the holidays and with everybody working and legislature, it's going to go fast. It's going to go fast.
Senator Cole.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think there's pros and cons to both sides of this. I think though, for me, from my point of view, having the information available to review is probably critical in understanding the big process. Because all the areas that I think the proposals will come from are going to be unique. And I think when it comes to somebody gaming the system, I think it'd be pretty easy to see that folks from Fremont County, I don't mean to pick on them, have a certain bias towards something, and it's going to be pretty easy to ferret out. This is such a big lift when it comes to scoring, let's say scoring, what an individual thinks is their most important thing. When you go through and review the proposals. I think that's one of those things that I think has to be looked at in totality, as opposed to what? As opposed to something else, because I think it's going to be levels and degrees of, say, adherence to what, you know, the wish list is on your RFP. So I think even though it has a downside to it, I think we owe it to the people that put an application in to have time to think about what they're doing, that make a value judgment on how that looks to another proposal. And I think the knowing of where that proposal came from, even though there's a downside risk, that people would legislatively or for some other reasons share information that was, I would call it unethical at that point, with other folks trying to tell them to game the system. I'll just tell you, I promise that I would never do that. And I would think the members of this committee would, I don't know, just going to speak for people that are trying to do the right thing for the state of Wyoming. So it is complex, but I would be in favor of knowing in batches, probably whatever is efficient for the LSO, that they would send out said proposals. So I would have a chance to look at them and have time to contemplate what that means in the big picture. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Continuing down table. Oh, Representative.
And just to bring another thought, someone brought it to my attention that sometimes there's like a thing like reverse discrimination, like when and here we go, but when we use a county's name all the time, it kind of puts it out there as to like, well, we can't pick them now because people will think. So if we're going to do it fairly and equally and without bias, we need to quit using county names. Okay, because really it does, because people could say, oh yeah, well, they've done this or this, and it really does create and somebody brought that to me. That wasn't my idea. Somebody brought it. So anyways, I just thought I would mention that.
Rebuttal, Senator Cole.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to substitute Fremont with Sweetwater County. If it makes people feel any better. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Down the table. Ms. Legursky, do you have any comment?
Teton County.
Regardless of what county we're talking about, I'm in complete agreement with Senator Kolb's remarks. I think it makes perfect sense to see what we're doing as we go along. Also, I think it's important to find out whether we were totally brilliant when we went for this first round. And if we find out there are giant gaps, it might be time, and it might be fair to all the people who are interested to make that announcement so they can revise what they have submitted and fill in those gaps, because maybe we weren't perfect initially in what we were looking for.
Thank you. I think that is part of what we were anticipating, that by seeing these letters of interest, we could make the final RFP better so that it does fill those gaps. Mr. Glenn.
Mr. Chairman, to me, this is a letter of interest. We have said very clearly, we are not calling anybody out with this. I do not know why we wouldn't share that information as soon as we get it. It will help us. And if other people from other communities see it, we're not going to call them out on that. So to me, it makes sense to see it when it comes in and to share that information because it's going to help us get the best RFP possible when we look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it would be helpful to maybe get a couple batches. This has me thinking about maybe a handful or less of the RFP processes I've worked on with our agency. And it's helpful to kind of see them in batches or as they come in, and even in the hiring process. I think one thing, I don't know if concern is the right word, but I would like to make clear that in those processes, I mentioned the experience I've been through. I don't want communities to feel like, well, now I better be first in to submit my letter. As we all know, who have hired people or done RFPs, you could have a couple you look at, and then the last one in is like, well, this one nailed it. So I would like to make sure that we're not sending the message that there's a reason to be first in this process, if that makes sense. So.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm with our state parks counterpart here on this one. When we do big jobs or any jobs at Game and Fish, we do a pre-proposal meeting, which invites all entities in to look at things. And that is critical in the process because we learn things that we didn't initially know when we opened it up for pre-proposal. So I would say that my vote would be that we either do batches or something so that we get that information prior to. This process is it's been set up in a way to where nobody's going to favor anything. We need to get that information so that that RFP has everything in it that we need to get the best product at the end. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the discussion has evolved a little bit as it went around the tables. Anyone want a second bite at the apple, Senator Cole?
Third.
Yeah, third, I had to defend Sweetwater County's reputation there. But seriously, I think it'd be beneficial if people to put a proposal in early. And I say that because it'll give people more time to consider it. I think anyone who dumps a proposal in late is at a disadvantage, not an advantage. So I'm in general consensus that I think we should get them in whatever an appropriate batch is. I do not think they should be published generally, just between the committee members to have a chance to review them and to understand maybe the questions that would come up or the priorities that you have as an individual that would come up while we develop the actual sorting out of what the applications are. Certainly for me, I'm just going to speak for me, it would be greatly beneficial. But so I think getting them in early is a plus, because I certainly don't want them all dumping in at the end. And I just think that the more time people give other people to look at what they proposed and think about it, is going to be a better product. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the comment.
Aaron?
Mr. Chairman. It feels like maybe a split would be if we have access to some information and we learn something that we feel might be valuable, to give everybody a heads up so that they can start looking for putting in place, more information or a change that maybe we could provide those updates, unmask to everybody that say, hey, here's something that we haven't considered before that everybody might want to look at.
You talk about everybody, talking about the task force or the committees, the communities that might be submitting?
Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and that may be something that we should consider. I think it gets back to Judy's thing of the immaculate letter of interest. We pretty well know that there's probably going to be things that we didn't have, and if something, and I think that would come back to the task force, right? It wouldn't be the individuals, but if there's something said, we just missed something here because this is not the immaculate letter of, the perfect thing that went out, and because there's going to be a lot of questions. And I think at that point in time, if that happened, which is possible, and somebody on the task force identify it's just a matter of setting up a Zoom call and say, hey, we need to go back to those people that have already submitted and say, hey, what about this issue? Can you provide more information? Is that kind of where you're headed? If something comes up, it's a glaring deficiency on our part.
Exactly.
All right. Yeah, I think that would be something that we'd want to incorporate in there. Okay.
So let me throw another possibility out there. I think maybe Representative Ottman mentioned it. In my world, we do a lot of grading in the blind where the name of the student who submitted the paper is not on the paper. You just grade it, not knowing whose paper it is, right? So we're not grading anything with these letters of interest, but I think it'd be possible to have a redacted version, circulated among the committee where the name of the submitting entity and any information that might identify which community submitted that proposal could be redacted. So you'd still get the information, but it would get away from the idea that, we're trying to tailor something to a particular submission. I guess I asked Josh, how much of a headache would that be to try to redact, not knowing what they might look like, but there could be language throughout the document that might.
I think it'd be impossible.
Yeah, so Mr. Chairman, without seeing these yet, I don't know for sure how possible that would be. It's certainly something we could look into as they start to come in. If that would be something you would want to consider.
Give you a hypothetical example, especially when we get to the other amenities list. Oh, we're 80 miles from the east entrance of Yellowstone Park. We have this wonderful hot springs. Well, we got this canyon that has a big sinkhole in it where there runs under. It would be absolutely physical impossible to be able to redact all of that information out from a standpoint. Or you could be the county where the wind, it's east of the county where the wind blows so hard.
Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. I have the utmost faith in the people on this committee that they could figure out exactly. And if they couldn't, I'd be saddened, but I am sure everybody here could figure out where the area is. But thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Mr. Chair, would it be worthwhile, Josh? I don't know if we could look to state construction to really look at how we do our bid process. And I know this isn't really in line with exactly what we're doing here, but there's a process in place that we could follow, that all of our state agencies follow, that kind of outlines this, that would, I think, give us good pause for all, it would quell our concerns with this. And I'm just wondering if we might learn from something from that to help us out with this.
Josh, you take a look at that. I think there's pretty much consensus starting to bubble up that we want to see these sometime before March 1st, that the task force at least would get them in batches as they come in. And that way, if nothing else, it's just more efficient on the reading side. Some of these might be rather thick. And if we get 15 of them all on March 1st, it could be a daunting task to read through them all. Committee, is that fair? Or is there a consensus that we want to see them? Okay, so that provides some guidance for you to get them out, and forget I ever mentioned redacting.
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we'll come up with some type of process to do them, and it seems like there's consensus to do them, and not necessarily every time one comes in, but in some series of batches, and we'll figure that out, Mr. Chairman.
So I think we have a game plan here for what we're going to do with these letters of interest. Remember, I think it's real important that we remember we're not scoring these. We're not putting anybody in or out. Well, what we're looking at is, what are we seeing? Is there, 50 communities submitting proposals? Or are there 5 communities submitting proposals, right? Yeah, and then if there's anything that we recognize to say, we really need to know this, and it's not here, right? Then we can decide as a group whether to go back out and ask for a supplemental on the letter of interest, or do we just wait and make sure that we add that missing component into the RFP when it comes out? And so I think that's what happens a lot of times with these state agencies when they have the pre-meeting. And some engineer from the XYZ company says, well, what about this? And everybody looks around the table and goes, hadn't thought about that. And then you can build it into the RFP. So you have that pre-meeting. And I think this letter of interest is basically that pre-meeting. It gives us that early opportunity. And then, I just invite the communities that if you see something that you think is really glaringly missing out of the RFP, feel free to attach a cover letter. Right? And that might give us a heads up that maybe we missed something on the RFP that you all think is critically important. That's not there, or not the RFP, but on the letter of interest. So feel free to add a cover letter to your submissions and give us a heads up if you think there's something missing. Co-chairman?
So, Mr. Chairman, so I think that we've got direction there, and to a certain degree, at least I think we can agree that's how we want to move forward. So, the next couple of things that we need to address is, the scoring system, how are we going to develop the scoring system and a ranking system for these proposals? But I'd like to get some input from both the task force and any of those entities out there. So we have talked so this is just a letter of interest to say, yes, we have a local community project. We're working on this. We want to. So the next thing is it would be the full-blown RFP. So we need to, there's a couple of questions there. How long do we leave that open from March 1st until that full-blown RFP has to be submitted? And so we need to get some discussion. We have had some previous discussions is at that point in time, we would take those RFPs and then look at them and either screen those down to the top X, 3, 5, whatever it is, or go through those and say, okay, here's where we didn't understand. Here's where you may be a little deficient, and then send it back to them and say, would you like to address these issues and resubmit? So that's one alternative, which adds more time onto the process. So one of them is, how long do we want to leave that? Is it 90 days? And I do want to get public input from every one of the entities that's here today, Mr. Chairman, or on that as to how long we should leave that open from March 1st till they have to have their final RFP. And then for the task forces, do we want to then go through every one of those and then have them resubmit and then rank them? Or do we just want to cut those to the top X, whether that's top 3, top 5, whatever, and then have those resubmit based on input back from the task force? So there's about 3 questions there, Mr. Chairman. So I'll let you figure out which one you want to tackle first.
Well, let's do this. Let's make sure we wrap up the letter of intent update on the agenda item. Is there
Oh,
anything
yep.
else on letter of intent? I'll make sure we're giving Josh anything further on letter of intent. You're good.
So, Mr. Chairman, just for everybody, that'll be posted on the LSO website.
It currently is, Mr.
It's-
Chairman, excuse me, it is posted on our website and in a couple of places. We also sent it out to Wyoming Association of Municipalities and the Wyoming County Commissioners Association.
Okay,
So
thank
to
you.
send out to their groups.
Okay, and there is an email address on that proposal, so all those submissions will come directly to the LSO, and then they will batch them up and get them out to the task force, and they will be made public on March 2nd. That's the game plan. Everybody clear on letters of intent? All right. So before we dive into these momentous questions of the co-chairman, let's take about a 10-minute break and give everybody a chance to stretch their legs, and we'll come back and dive into item 4 on the agenda. Thank you, everyone. Welcome back. I did manage to forget all three of the questions that the co-chairman asked before we took our break. So when he gets back up here, we'll have him see if he can remember the three questions that he had, and then we will consider those. We have a lot of work ahead of us as the task force, and Mr. Goldman brought up the key point that if we get the letters of interest on March 1st, if our goal is to have a selection done in time for the 2025 legislative session, it's going to be tight from March till January to get all the work done necessary for a proposal at the 2025 session. But that would certainly be my goal, that we be ready for the 2025 session. It may not happen, with the way things evolve, we'll have to see. But the longer we push it out, the more change you're going to see within the, post-election world. So it will be interesting to see where we're at. So back to Mr. Co-Chairman. Your three questions. Could you restate those for us?
And up front, so once we hit March 1st, getting back to this question that Ron and you just talked about, is the time frame to get things done. And so the next thing we need, and I think the sooner that we can set that, say you've got 60 days that you have to have your RF, or is it 90 days? What's that time frame that we need to get those in? So that's the first question. The second component of that is we have discussed a couple of options. And one option is once we get those in, that we would just screen those down to the top number of proposals and then send those back and say, you're in the top, whatever that number is, 3, top 5, and give those potential entities another opportunity and say, look, now refine your proposal that we've screened it down to the top 5. Let's say this, use that for an arbitrary number. And then they go back and re-refine, provide additional informations and questions that the task force have. Or do we do that for all of the applicants? And so everybody gets a second opportunity to resubmit with the refined proposals to answer the task force questions. Again, that adds another whole series of time on there. And then from that, you just pick the top proposal. So there's really two alternatives that we need to look at. Say, look, do you want to screen it? Say, take the top 5, then have them resubmit. As part of that process, I do think that we need to do a site visit. That's another time constraint too. But really, so what I'd like to do is just go around to each, just like we have before, each member of the task force and get your thoughts. Do we want to do, once we designate that it's within 90 days or 60 days, you have to have your proposal back in. Do we say we're just going to take the top X and then tell those folks to go back and refine it? Or do we tell everybody, here's your second bite at the apple to do it, and then after that, you just pick the top? So, Kay, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. So when we met in Riverton, one of the things we talked about was having within the scoring matrix, once we decide how we're going to do that, whether it's a golf score, the lowest is winning, or but we set a mark and say basically everyone that exceeds 150 points moves into round 2. But I would propose that once we set that mark of whatever it is, that's an elimination round, that we then take the 6 or 10 or 12 or 2 that make the cut, and that they then have a chance to refine and improve their proposal for a second round.
Aaron?
Mr. Chairman, what would be the potential negative of letting everybody advance, other than lots of site visits?
It would seem to me it depends upon the numbers. If we have 12 applicants, that doubles the work if we have 6, right? So that would be the only detriment of having everybody go forward, is if there's a large number that would be more time consuming and unworkable. And site visits to 12 places might be more cumbersome to get scheduled for the committee than 6.
I guess I would be on board with some elimination, but how many? Like, how many would we want to advance? Seems like the more people we have working and developing and improving their proposals, the better opportunity we have to get the best product for the state.
Yep.
So I'd want to make sure maybe it wasn't limited to arbitrarily to a score, because what if that turns into 2? But maybe it's more of a quantity. Maybe it's a quantity that we feel we can adequately assess and evaluate, you know, with our resources and time. And obviously that quantity is not 20. But it feels like 2 or 3 might be a little bit slim if we do have, you know, some good candidates. Maybe it's that number for me that would.
That makes sense. Representative Altman for Fremont County.
Oh, bad mistake, bad
So it's,
mistake. Yeah,
Mr. Co-Chair from the Toronto County
there we go, Mr. Co-Chair.
and the city of Casper.
There we go, there we go. I need a point of clarity as how the scoring is gonna fix in here. Are we looking at scoring and then giving 30 to 90 days? Are we looking at giving 30 to 90 days and then producing the scoring and then talk about elimination, or how, what are we talking about?
You know, in a way, we're kind of ahead of ourselves because we're just now asking for letters of interest. And now we're talking about what do we do after the RFPs? We haven't even developed the RFP, right? So we're a bit of ahead of ourselves with this discussion, but I don't think it's harmful for us to start thinking ahead a bit about how we're going. So it would seem to me as a practical reality, you're going to have to score things and then they have 90 days or you're not going to score things. You're going to ask for we'll finalize our RFP. We'll have a fixed number of days for them to submit the formal RFP. And then we will score those RFPs and then we'll decide who's left in the hunt. That makes sense?
Mr. Co-Chairman, yes. But I think that since this is such a large thing and there's so many working pieces, that to give the opportunity to submit, to improve, to change, to make that conversation with whomever, I think that should be an opportunity for people. I don't know on the time, like maybe 60 days or something, because they should have those relationships or whatever going. But I think that people, because oftentimes, and something of this magnitude and what we're looking at for quality and possibly stages, I think once people have an idea of how they're doing, that they need time to improve or to change, or for lack of a better word, tweak. So that's my opinion.
A senator from Sweetwater County.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman from Toronto County. Yeah, I think we do. I would believe that picking 5, let's say 5, I think 5's a pretty good number. With not knowing how many people will submit, sends a message to the other people who have submitted, other entities, that this is an expectation that we expect. And I think that has value, because once again, you know, we hear that people are, well, what do you want? You know, now there's going to be an opportunity here to say that, okay, these 5 are top 5. But I think that won't preclude the others who aren't in the top 5 to amend whatever they proposed, and they could submit that. But I think you set an expectation that if you don't make it and there's something lacking that's, you know, a glaring issue, that, you know, the odds of being successful are a lot lower. So I think if we pick top 5, we set an expectation, which I think we need to set something to tell the entities that are submitting, these are the things we care about, and then we would allow them to resubmit if they wish to, so they aren't excluded. And I think those are to me, I think that sounds like it's productive. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Gursky.
I'm a bit confused here. I don't want us to be disingenuous. We told everyone that these initial submittals would not exclude anyone. So we are talking about the second round of RFPs of then narrowing it down and then making site visits and then doing the legwork.
Yes.
And okay, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that we were following through on what we had originally said.
Yes. To reiterate, these letters of interest don't screen anybody in or out. We're talking about right now, the RFP process, which will follow. So go ahead.
Obviously, there are going to be a number that will percolate to the top. And I'm not sure that we're smart enough right now to say whether that number will be 3 or 5 or 2 or 7. And so I would hope that we will stay open to looking to see which of those numbers do percolate up and which are obviously superior and which deserve for us to take the time, cumbersome or not, but to get it right.
So, Mr. Co-Chair, so Judy, under that scenario, we still have to have some subjective as to tell people why we're not moving your proposal on. And so, I mean, so how would you suggest under that scenario? Because then it does become arbitrary, and I suppose there's a number of ways that we could deal with that, but just your thoughts on, do we send it back to everybody gets a second bite at the apple? Or do we screen it based on a score or a number, or do we just let the committee come back and say each member of the committee do a kind of a rank choice, give us your top 5? Typically in these type of things, there tends to be an obvious break, not always,
right?
But there's an obvious break, and then do we then say, okay, we've got, say, 12 proposals. There's 7 of them, or 2 of them, or 5 of them that the committee under a rank choice, rank yours 1 through 12, 1 through 12, 1 through 12, 1 through 12, 1 through 12. And see where that falls out, and then tell those applicants to then go back and say, here's issues that we'd like you to address. Here's where your proposal's weak. It may be just acres of land, whatever that infrastructure, whatever that we see as a potential deficiency, and say, here's an opportunity to go back and rework that. So I still grapple with, is that everybody gets a second bite, or do we establish a cut line based on some criteria? So let's finish going around.
Right. Judy, you want?
Mr. Co-Chairman, I think the second bite is the RFP. And I agree with you that there are definitely those that once we see them are going to be superior to others. And maybe the hard thing is going to be telling 4 of them, actually, we're not going to reconsider this, and we're not going to be making site visits. And we might actually have to say why.
No, we will.
And that's the hard work. But we might just have to do that. This is a big deal. The people are really interested in it. And every shooter out there knows more than we do, because you can just ask any of them and they'll tell us. So we're going to
Did you say shooter or legislator?
I said shooter.
Just
there may be some of both, however. So no, I'm much more familiar with shooters than I am with legislative knowledge. Thank you.
Mr. Glenn.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I'll call you shooter. I guess I look at this a little bit different. It seems to me that and I'll be an outlier here, I understand, but it seems to me that we're doing this request for information now. And I believe our job was to look at that and go back to the communities and say, this is interesting, this is good, here's some places you need to improve. So we're already giving them that feedback, if that's the way I see it. I personally don't see a need for 2 RFPs. I think if we do our jobs with this request for interest, and we do our jobs setting really clear criteria of what we're looking for and how we're going to rank it, I think we can do it in one RFP process. And I think we're trying to make it as open to everybody as we possibly can. But we can do that by putting that RFP together that's really clear, very qualified. And it may mean that we have to go do site visits for everybody that submits an RFP, but we only do one. That's my suggestion, my thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. Mr. Chair. Yeah, a lot of thoughts. I'm glad we made it clear that the letter of interest, you submit that, you're still alive. I think
Everybody's in.
we go to an RFP. I think we've talked previously about whether it's a scoring matrix of 150 points, or I think we've heard like 80% of what is required is met in an RFP that keeps you in. I like that possibly one RFP round. But I think you do have to establish some minimum requirements and to advance. I mean, there's going to be some things that are just going to be hard, whether we go back and work with certain communities. There may be things they just can't do for whatever reason, whatever category, pick it. So I think the cleanest would be to establish what criteria in the RFP do you need to meet, and what is that threshold, whether it's points or percentage, if that makes sense. And I would think by the RFP round, through all the work that's been done with the letter of intent and these meetings, that probably 60-day reply would be sufficient, but we have communities here who might otherwise have another opinion, but so that'd be my two answers.
Mr. Co-Chair, so Ron, under that scenario, and it would be more of a question for everybody, but back to Dave, but specifically start with you is so under those scenarios, and I agree, one really good RFP, we've already done a letter of interest, so they know what we're looking for, then it's gonna be a very detailed RFP, much more extensive information side. So under those scenarios, I don't think we need to do, I would agree with that. But then do you just select the winner from that? Who is going to get the recommendation at that point in time under the scenario you just talked about? Is that the final?
That's what I was thinking. I mean, we're, as mentioned earlier, we're kind of dealing in, I don't want to say hypotheticals, but we still have the LOI process to finish March 1st, but it would seem that whatever scoring matrix we come up with, it's going to produce out of the RFP 3, 5, 10 communities, and then site visits, and then we really drill down to, okay, so they qualified at 150 points or 80% of the criteria. Who exceeds from there? Who can?
So you would say we'd still screen that down. That wouldn't be the one comes out of that RFP. That's what I'm trying to say. So under your scenario, we get the ranking in place, all the proposals come in, we go through those, and then we're going to make a recommendation on that.
I think
we're going to pick a winner.
I think we could.
I think I heard RFP, site visits, then selection. I think that's the process.
That's what I'm trying to get
from one
to one RFP. Yeah.
So Eric.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this letter of interest should give us enough information. We've got to get the RFP right. That's got to be right and have everything in there that we're going to look at. But we should be able to narrow it down to one. Maybe part of the RFP, I guess Appendix A, is what that criteria on a site visit might be to help us do that elimination. But at the end of the RFP process that I'm familiar with, there's one winner. Thank you.
So my comments on this, Mr. Co-Chairman, would be something akin to what we do in the legal process when you appeal. Right? You file written briefs, which would be the RFP, and then we invite either all of them, depending upon how many we have, or those that score the best, to then give us an oral presentation. And they come and they bring their slideshow and they give us their presentation. We can ask them questions about, you look like you're weak here. Are there any ideas of how you might be able to bolster that, right? Or maybe we just misinterpreted some of the information in their RFP, and that gives them a chance to rebut our concerns or fill in the gaps or whatever. And then after we've heard those oral presentations, we decide to go do site visits. That's how I envision.
Mr. Vice Chairman, I agree with you 100%. That is, when we go through state processes, that is the process that goes through. We narrow it down, we look at them. Or in fact, we don't narrow it down. We look at all those, and then they do come in and give an oral presentation, which helps us define those. And it does help you pick the best of the best.
Mr. Co-Chairman, there are 2 wild cards, so we do have to have some flexibility. One is going to be land. There might be a RFP that says we're going to acquire this land from so-and-so, but that's not a done deal in most cases. So we'll see a wild card with land that might take our front runner out of it after negotiations fall through. And the other is governance structure. They might make a pitch that Game and Fish is going to run the entire thing, or they're going to own all the land. And then after some legal research, we find out that maybe that can't happen that way. And it might take them out, even though they qualify early on. So we do need some flexibility down to the wire, being able to say, okay, you're number one if these things happen. If not, you're out.
So, and that's, Mr. Co-Chair, that's a very important point. So because of the potential land acquisition or leasing or whatever arrangement those are, is obviously they're not going to go acquire. There may be some entity that has the land already, but most likely it's going to require some type of lease or acquisition of land and stuff. So it's contingent, right? That would have to happen before the 2025. So we need, at the very least, have to have an absolute letter of commitment, on a sales agreement on land sales or lease agreement. So I agree with that. And if you can't cut the deal and it can't be done, then it goes to number 2. So I think into that process, even if we went through Ron and selected out, here's our number 1, it's contingent upon this. If you can't fulfill these requirements, AKA execute at least a contract for sale on a parcel of land, then it would revert to number 2. Is that, I think that's a good point, Kid.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I feel like we should have a selection process, maybe, after oral presentations. Otherwise, we're going to open ourselves up to 20, 24, 30. What's the number? Site visits, even though we know, say, that bottom 2/3 aren't even in the running. If we have a selection process, we can say, we're going to take the top 5 and those are going to get site visits. That way we can minimize the potential scope of what those look like.
And I agree with that. I think you have to narrow it down. If there's 12 proposals, we can't take 12 days and travel time around the state. And particularly if you look at it, say it's just not going to fly anyway. Number 1, I think we're stringing along the project proponents when it's a weak proposal and can't comply, as to go do and even to invite them in to do a presentation. Typically with state agencies, I deal a lot. There's a screening process. And then you bring in the top 5. And you do the oral presentations, and maybe at that time you screen it down to the actual site visits from the top 2 or 3. I just think you have to whittle this thing around. But I don't want to string people along and spend a lot of time doing site visits on a very weak proposal. So,
And it will go to Aaron, but another thing that we're gonna have to think about here is we could easily be into the fall of the year or later when we finally get to site visits. And, the weather conditions and all the rest can compound all that. So Aaron, your comment?
Mr. Chairman, one more consideration. If we suggest that there's a second bite at improving your RFP,
they don't work as hard.
I feel like we're not going to get the best efforts in the first place. I would propose that we do one proposal. And it's a one-shot deal, and then our selection process is just in fact finding through the oral, through the site visits, and whatever follow-up we need to do, but we're not allowing amended proposals. It's a one-shot deal. That way we get our best efforts right out of the gate.
Others, Mr. Glenn?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to go back what Cade was talking about a little bit too, regarding we have to have some flexibility, and I agree 100%. And again, I'm going to beat the dead horse on the state RFP process. That's what we do. We have very clear that we're going to negotiate a contract once we pick the top winner, and if that doesn't work, we go to the next one. So we have that in place, and I think it does give us that flexibility, Cade, to say. First off, I think our criteria should say, if you own the land, you may get higher points than if you're going to have to go get a land transfer from the feds or buy some land. First off, I'd say that. But I think secondly, it does provide that ability to be flexible, to go back with them and negotiate. And that's all the way to the management, how you're going to manage it as well.
So
Mr. Co-Chairman?
just to capture Joss if we can, and so what we're gonna do is there will be only, the RFP will go out at that point in time. I think we're in agreement on that. And from that, the next thing is to pare those proposals down. So and we've got a scoring system, or we just take the top X. That's not resolved yet as to how we're gonna pare that down. So anybody want to propose? And so we're going to have a scoring system in place by the time these things get back. And in fact, we need to have it done and actually to be, if we can get this done as part of the RFP and just say, this is how you will be ranked. So everybody knows going into it, this is how you're going to be ranked. So where do we want to pare it down to based on, and we haven't got to how we would score those yet. That's on the agenda for discussion yet, whether it's a 1 to 5 or good, bad, subjective, numeric. That's a discussion that we need to go through, but how do we want to pare those down?
Representative Altman?
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. Speaking of that, so what I'm hearing is that the RFPs would be presented based on a scoring system that we would manufacture. No, that's coming second.
Yeah.
And if that is the way, then would it be possibly like the top 10 then would go into the oral presentations and then 5 into site selection?
I think it's within the entire possibility that we would include the scoring matrix in the RFP so that the proposals would know what are the top priorities, what's going to get scored higher, what are the definitions of a top score. And so we'd have that in the RFP ideally. But that does challenge us as a task force to sharpen the pencils and get to work on this scoring system, because I think that's going to be the bread and butter of this. It's going to be a tremendous amount of work to figure out, what are the absolute have to haves, and some may just be pass fail. You either have it or you don't, or you may be a number of points. So, to me, it makes no sense to have a tremendous wow factor, but no place for people to sleep and eat. Right. So we're going to have to figure out how we're going to rank all that and what are our top priorities. Senator Cole.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I think after listening to other people's opinion that we just would pick the top 5 and then deal with that going forward and develop the top 5, is we're going to have to make a decision at one point or the other about.
Would that top 5 be based on the scoring matrix, just a numeric rating?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. But I think in the scoring matrix, Mr. Co-Chair, it's going to be a little tricky because I think I would look at this as a whole package. I mean, in its entirety. So to give a rank per individual line item may not be reflective of the total package. I think there's a lot to consider here because there's a lot of moving parts to this, and it's going to be a value judgment. So I'd be Hopefully we could develop a scoring system. If we're gonna do an individual system, that would be reflective of that. I just didn't want to get to the point where you'd pick one over the other because of a numerical number, when overall it wasn't the best choice. That's my concern.
Ron?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, the more I think about it, I kind of like here's the list of criteria, so it's very clear. And maybe a pass fail, and then a percentage of 80% or 90% or whatever, and then we get into the site visits, the discussion. That seems I don't know, could get messy with points or other things. And as I think about it off the top of my head here, pass fail, percentage you threshold set by the task force you met. Let's work from there. That makes sense.
So pass fail on each line item, basically, and then you need some percentage, 80% overall. You have to pass 80% of the line items in order to move forward. Is that what you're, something like along those lines?
Yes, sir.
Task force, anybody else?
So, Mr. Chairman, does that mean we will do a second round of RFPs? Just one round. So help me understand that. So a pass fail and then you move forward into what? Seems to me like you're going to pick the top one by looking at the RFPs.
Well, what I'm thinking is the pass fail 80% criteria, whatever that is, would determine who does an oral presentation
And a site.
and a site visit.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of where my head's at. Is within that RFP, there'll be a rank category based on the categories that we have in our letter of interest. Somewhere there's going to be a numeric value. Somewhere we're going to narrow it down to get to part B of that RFP, which might be oral interviews and presentations. And then also incorporate site visits. So through that one RFP, we're going to have a process to narrow it down. If we start with 12, we might get down to 5, oral presentations down to 3, site visits, maybe 1 or 2.
That seems like where we're going.
Okay, thank you.
But the numbers of proposals that will ultimately be heard may be determined upon just how many we get and so forth. You know, if we only get 5 viable proposals, we may say we're going to do 5 site visits and do 5. Everybody gets to participate in the oral interview process. So really, I think the numbers are going to help us decide, do we need to winnow anything before we invite people in for oral presentations? That makes sense to everybody?
Yeah, and
Mr.
Mr. Chairman, I do think that today, I don't know that we absolutely, let's see how many letters of interest we get. And I think we can leave that a little bit open, you know, is to say, as long as we know what the process is and they know what the process is, that, you know, with the RFP, there'll be a ranking system. And as part of that, the task force will screen those applicants down in May, may request an oral presentation and a site visit. It may be just one knocks it out of the park and it's a unanimous, you know, unlikely, and it may just be 2. And versus just trying to pick a criteria, you know, that we've locked into the point where it just doesn't make sense from a standpoint of bringing people in and, you know, additional information. And now we're going to come out and look. And if we say 5, it may be that there's 3 that are just heads and tails above. If we set a score, there may be one that's a 99.99 and another one that's a 98, and the next score is 80.5. If we use the 80, it's just an obvious break. So again, to expedite the process, I think we have to maintain some of that flexibility within that Cade was talking about. And so I think we can just basically specify that, you know, this is how that we will move forward. Does that work for everybody?
Well, yes and no.
It does, and Mr. Chairman, if I could,
Yeah,
something that would help my brain linear is if we worked a little bit from a T-minus schedule, figure out what we need to accomplish by when.
Yeah.
So we really understand how much time, we're throwing around 60 days, 90 days, coming back for a second review, oral. If we're trying to accomplish all of this so that it can go to a committee, so it can go to the legislature in January of 25, we definitely have a time frame. And I think everyone out here would really like to know what that time frame is as well. It's probably the second most asked question right after, what is it you guys want? So we still don't know the number one, but I think we can figure out the number two.
so, Mr. Co-Chairman, legislatively, do you anticipate we need a bill to move this forward in the 25 session for the funds to be allocated? It'll be a bill. The task force can't bring a bill, so we'd have to have our bill proposal to a standing committee by probably November at the latest. It's probably either October, whenever they have their third meeting of whichever standing committee we decide we're going to take this through. So we're not talking January, we may be talking October or November. Would you agree with that process? Does that have to go to a standing committee for a bill draft, or are you going to bring it individually, or how you want to do this?
There's a number of mechanisms to do that. Because of the existing legislation that's out there. The only thing that we need to do now at this point in time is make a recommendation. And the way that bill was constructed, the task force would still stay in place. So there's going to be some, once we select it, it's just not all over, right? So there's going to be a role for the task force as far as plans, architectural designs, all of that stuff. We've always said up front that the state will provide out of that $10 million, part of that will provide all the architectural stuff, some of the contracting. At that point in time, we'll bring SBC in. So it could be a bill. I don't know if it needs to be that complex as much as it's just it could be something we just take to the Joint Appropriations Committee and ask for authorization to move forward with that. So there's pros and cons both. Let us think about that. But so it gets back to your timeline though, irregardless of that, the Joint Appropriations Committee would be the last one that we'd want to go through, would be probably the second week in December. They have to have it before then. So we would have to have something by the end of November. I mean, that's our drop dead. If we decide that we need to go through a standing committee, which would probably be travel, recreation and wildlife. Normally that's late October 1st, and by mid-November, they're going to be done with all of their committee stuff. So the point being is we really need to shoot to have all of our stuff, recommendation ready to go. We've selected a site by, I'm going to say November 1st. So backing into that now.
Mr. Chairman.
Kate, I do think that the T-minus approach has great merit. Thank you for bringing that forward. Josh?
Mr. Chairman, just to jump in real quickly, but there is in the bill, there's an October 1 report date. Not that everything would have to be finalized by then, but there is the requirement that we do submit a report by October 1.
Thank you. That's helpful.
So it's October 1, Kate.
Mr. Chairman, just out of curiosity, is that a report to a committee or is that the full legislature?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, that's a report to the governor, joint appropriations and joint travel committees.
Of activities of the task force, it does not say a decision.
That's right. It just says we have a report. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're done. We may say, our report may say anticipate a selection by November 1. So we could still stretch it out.
Yeah, and then November 1's like the drop dead date that we need to have a recommendation out. But it would be better to have October and just include it in the one report. So, but co-chair's right. The report doesn't specify that it has to be an absolute recommendation, but the later we get, it just makes it easier if we do it all in one report. So let's shoot for an October 1st deadline. Then I'm all wrapped up with this for hunting season. I'm good to go. And
Okay.
so let's back into this then.
So let's start talking about that T minus.
Yeah.
We'll start working backwards and help us think collectively, what are the steps and some due dates that we might want to plug into this T minus calendar. So if we have our selection made by the 1st of October, that means site visits sometime in September. The site visit's going to be the last step before selection, or is there something after that? Kate?
I mean, I think site visits are the second to last thing. The decision's the last thing. So we need to visit the sites, and then we need a meeting and some time to put all that together and make our final recommendation before October 1st. So I think you're looking at site visits need to happen August 15th-ish. Because it's going to take us, we see what scheduling is like. So if we're visiting 5-6 locations, that's probably not happening in 2 days.
And I'm anticipating that it will probably, with everybody's schedule and everything else, and knowing that not everybody's, if we narrow it down to 3 or 4 or 5, not everybody's going to probably be able to make every site visit, but you're talking a minimum of 2 weeks. I mean, it's from every diagonal corner in the state of Wyoming. So
Unless business council wants to request the jet, we can just hop around.
Parts are
So I'm thinking August 1st to 15th would be site visits.
So we
A
should,
September meeting for the decision of the task force.
so
and-
we should be completed with site visits by September,
I put August 15th.
August 15th, done with site visits.
And then what do we have to have done before we start site visits? What would you put on the?
So we have to screen it down. So when does that happen?
So those would be the oral presentations? That'd be in July? I'm just thinking out loud here.
Late July, 1st of August, that 2-week time frame.
Okay. And then RFP scoring would have to be taking place before the orals. So that's looking at early July.
Mr. Chairman, I would throw out the RFP scoring. Seems to me it has to happen after the orals. It seems like I get that we're gonna have a list of folks, but the orals are gonna provide us more information to make that cut. Then I'm struggling with how to go through that process.
So let's.
So I think that's
call
going
the
to
initial
depend a little bit.
screen.
Just,
Okay.
it seems to be that part of it's going to be determined by how many applications we get, how many RFPs we get. If we only get 5 or 6, we can do orals for all of them. If we get 12, we're going to have some criteria to limit who comes in for orals. So we're going to have to do at least a pre-scoring or preliminary scoring, then orals, then final scoring. That makes sense, to everybody?
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I think that makes sense from a standpoint that we'll have to actually go through that scoring to screen them down. So then we've narrowed it down, and that's when we bring them in and do before the final selection, which would occur by September or August 15th, whatever that date was. That's when we have to do the site visits and the oral presentations from the groups. And so getting to your question, Dave, we have to have gone through the ranking system to get to that point. The decision hasn't been made. That's the key component. We've ranked them. Now we're getting all the additional information from the site visits and the oral presentation before the task force takes final action, which is to recommend that work.
So this sounds like the RFPs are gonna be due by the end of June, scored in early July. Orals in late July. Site visits in August. A meeting for a decision in September, and our report to the JAC in 1st of October. So for those of us who will be campaigning during those summer months, or might be, gonna be a little more
It's
challenging for
nice
House
to be a
members.
senator.
But it does look like it'll be a busy summer for the task force. Comments on that rough outline of what we're looking at, that the RFPs are likely due by the end of June?
And so we have to build in some time there for each one of the members to be able to go through each one of those. You know, and we'll have to get together. So we'll have a numeric ranking system, but we still have to get down and it's a decision of the committee as to what to rank. I mean, each one individual could say, well, you know, I've ranked this, you know, and some of it's just gonna be obvious, you know. You get X number of points distance from a regional airport, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm curious as to you guys' thoughts, how much time do you think it has to go through the ranking, which would already be done and completed and part of the application? But we're the ones that are actually gonna have to rank them. It's not their job. They just need to understand what the ranking criteria are. Some of it's gonna be just really objective. I mean,
Mr. Chair. So just so I'm clear, when would we open the RFP? Are we talking April 1st?
Seems to me that we'd probably be opening the RFPs in June. And then have time for committee to score those.
Understand, Mr. Co-Chair.
Go ahead.
Let me clarify. When can they submit the RFP? Like, what's the period? 60
that's
days,
what we're
90
trying to
days?
back into to say, how long do you have to get them to
That's why I'm wondering if it's April 1st and we do April and May. Gives us June to work them. And then we start getting into the timeline that you've already established.
You know, if we're ready. You know, we're gonna get the pre-submission, the letters of interest by March 1. So if we've got the scoring matrix done, we can probably crank out our final RFP stuff in March, would be my guess. That we can have the RFP ready by the end of March, give them April and May to submit their RFPs, 60 days. And then we have June for scoring.
I think so first we got to go through all those pre-proposals, and I don't remember who it was. I think it was Judy said, you know, what deficiencies. I mean, we may have the RFP done and then we get all these submissions and say, oh, no, we need to tweak this and tweak that and make sure that we've got all the right information. And so I think we're going to have at least one meeting after everybody's reviewed the letters of interest and have the draft RFP in front of us and then go through that and then approve that final draft to then go out. And so I think that's going to take the entire month of March to get that done. And so the RFPs would not even be available until April 1st. And then the question is, based on that schedule, looks like they got about 6 weeks to get them turned around and back to us. So by April 1st, by May 15th, they're available April 1st. By May 15th, they have to have them back to the task force. And I do want to take public comment on that, whether 6 weeks is an adequate amount of time, knowing all the pre-work, letters of interest, all this stuff is going on. It seems to me like that's an adequate amount of time, but that's the kind of a time for, I think we're going to need that time after we get the letters of interest, even if we've got a draft to work that final RFP, because it's the final document that's gonna be guide the decisions. Everybody concur with that?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's why I brought that up, because I think we're gonna get a lot of information on the letter of interest, and we're gonna need time to develop the RFP.
But if we're getting the information from these letters of interest as they come in, we're not necessarily starting on March 1st. We may have some ideas for improving the RFP well before March 1st, right? So we can still be making some progress. And it'd be my hope that the task force would meet at least once during the session in Cheyenne, and that we would get together. And I know traveling from Cody to Cheyenne in February is your favorite thing to do, but it might be advantageous for us to gather and continue some work one evening or something during the session. Co-chair?
I think it'd be good for everybody to come down and see how the barbarians work in Cheyenne. Especially the ones from Sweetwater County.
Okay, so I don't know that this timeline has to be absolutely rigid, but I think working back on the T minus gives us an idea that we'll have the month of March for the RFP development. And having the finalized version of the RFP released April 1st. And then we'll ask for some testimony here in a couple of minutes about whether 6 weeks is an adequate amount of time for turnaround. We could extend that into June, I think, and then evaluate the RFPs in late June and early July. So I think we could extend that submission period if it's seen as important. Then have oral presentations in late July, site visits the first couple of weeks of August, a meeting to render a decision in September, filing our proposal to JAC in 1st of October. That sounds like the timeline we're looking at. So let's open it up. Mr. Glenn, do you have a comment first? We'll go.
Mr. Chairman, just very briefly, 6 weeks seems really, really tight for me. For folks, if we're going to build the bomb in the basement and come up and say, here's a list of things, surprise to folks. And I think we want to give them a little bit more time on that, because we're going to have a lot of criteria and they're going to have to go out and do a lot of homework and those types of things. So I would just throw out, it seems really tight.
My hope is that most of the details are in the letter of interest, details that we're already soliciting. There might be a few more. There might be some finalizations of properties and access of lands, and maybe we come up with a couple because we don't have the ideal layout at the outset. So there might be a few things that are different in that RFP than are contained, although there may be more detail involved. I think that the whole idea of the letter of interest was to get a lot of the preliminary work done at the community level. But I am going to open it up to people from the communities to tell us whether you think 6 weeks is a workable time frame to once we put out the RFP. And I can see your mind thinking, well, it depends what you got in the RFP. If you throw us a wild card, it's going to be a little tight. So Kate?
Mr. Chairman, I want to make 2 points. One, I think we could give them all of April and May. I think we can process everything we need to in June with a meeting later in the month. So that gives them a little bit of flexibility. But I also want to remind everyone that's getting ready to submit proposals that they should not be wasting their time on designs, because that's one of the more intensive things, and we're going to hire a designer. So that's one of the things that would stretch their time frame if they were trying to do that, and we're not looking for that.
Right. And I would think that perhaps some of the things that might be well spent in a community during that time period is, site locations for structures, right? Because the soils might be different in different parts of your parcel. What parts of your parcel would be suitable for building a big building on top of it as opposed to setting up target frames on top of it? So that kind of detail work, although it's not engineering work, but getting a sense of, you know, what's the water table like, and is this a good place to build a building and so forth, might be the kind of thing that, while we're not asking for that in the letter of interest, it will probably be an issue for us to know, you know, is the land suitable for building a structure upon, right? Other comments? Senator Cole?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I can tell you the government, at the speed of government, 60 days minimum, probably typically towards 90 public notices. You're dealing with multi-agencies, you know, like counties to cities or whatever that may be. That's a tough timeline to meet because of that challenge. If things change, it's just so slow. You know, the Board of County Commissioners typically, you know, is restricted. They don't have a lot of meetings all the time. They have to call a special meeting. I suppose it could be done, but the way government works between different entities, I've just seen it not work out too quickly. So I think if we could, the maximum amount of time we can give them to make our timeline, I think we should afford them as much time as we can do to make the final timeline. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You know, the timeline I got laid out here, it looks like if we put the RFPs out by April 1st and we have them in by the end of June, we can score them in July and still make this thing work. So they would have all the way from 1st of April to the end of June to finalize their RFPs. I see a few heads nodding out there like that sounds a little more reasonable for folks.
Mr. Chairman, I would throw out, I think scoring will take us a week. I think if we have the criteria set up, there's a checklist. I haven't done a lot of RFPs in the past. You go through, you rank those, we all get together, we look at the numbers. I don't think it'll take that long if we set aside some time to do that.
Okay,
Just one more point on the timing. They should not be reinventing the wheel for the RFP either. They're doing all this pre-work. We gave them a very long time for the letter of interest, probably in hindsight longer than we needed to for the other timeframes, but all of that homework is going to be relevant to putting into our format for the RFP. So I think we can crunch it a little bit without, you know, I don't think we need to go 4 weeks or 6 weeks, but hopefully they're not starting from scratch when we release that RFP.
go ahead.
I guess under that, Mr. Chairman, so April 1st it goes out. So you got the whole month of April, whole month of May. I'd like to see them in to give the task force a little cushion on the backside for potential unanticipated needs. So 60 days seems like it's a reasonable time frame given the letter of interest. You know, most entities already have groups up. This is not new. I think 60 days is inadequate. So I would say sometime by the first week in June that we would want to have those in. So, Mr. Co-Chair, the other thing is just knowing that everybody's schedules are always busy and stuff. Josh, one of the things that once we've narrowed these down, if we can get some, what I will say, poll the task force members, so we know, say, first week of whenever we're going to meet to review those. Was that what? July 15th or June 15th, that send out who's available this week, who's available this week, and then try to pick the one day that week that the most task force members are available, but get that out sooner than later.
All right, so somebody run through this T-minus list and everybody let me know if this sounds like it's feasible for the task force. The RFP will be finalized and released April 1. So we have between now and April 1st to have an RFP, which will also include the scoring matrix. And then the RFPs will be finalized, released April 1st. The RFPs would be due the 1st of June. The RFP scoring would take place in the early part of June. Orals would then be scheduled for mid to late July. After the orals, first couple weeks of August, we would do site visits. September, we would have a meeting at the task force to make our final recommendation. We submit our report to JAC 1st of October. It work for everybody? Sound reasonable, feasible? Of course, plans always go to heck, right? First contact, and we just throw out the, we'll see, but this looks like a. Yeah, so again, thank you for the T minus scheduling idea. I think that makes a lot of sense and helpful. So let's open it up for public comment about the schedule. People in the room and on Zoom, if anybody wants to come forward and give us some feedback, please come forward, activate the green light, and introduce yourself to the committee for the record, task force but for the record, and then tell us what you want us to hear.
Paul Galovich, County Commissioner, Hot Springs County. And task force, appreciate all of your efforts and what you're doing here. It's a great thing and it's a great plan. One of my questions in regard to access of land property. So in the final RFP, you obviously would have a letter of intent from private landowners to be able to sell their land for this. My question would be, in that letter of intent that you'd have from private landowners, there would probably need to be some kind of a timeline that you grant to the landowner that the landowner is aware of. So for example, if he's the 1st of July or upon decision, if it is an area of location that you're picked, what kind of timeline would you recommend in a letter of intent from a private landowner with his intent to sell? And also just to point out, I think that to move forward with this completed by the 2025 session is a good idea. I think with inflation and all kinds of other issues, the quicker this can come about, probably the better it is. And I agree with the 60-day time frame for the RFP. I think that's adequate time frame as well. Thank you.
The land acquisition question, that's not my strong suit. Anybody on the task force want to chime in?
So I'll take a stab at it, but we may at some point in time have to get a little bit of a legal opinion. But my preference would be is if you've identified acquisition of private property, by the time you submit your RFP, because the first question I'm going to ask is, have you been in contact with the landowners? Do you have an agreement with the landowners that they would in fact be willing to sell to whatever entity is going to be the applicant and the owner of that land? And it may be, it doesn't necessarily mean that, because it could very well end up being the state of Wyoming acquires the land. That has not been determined. We've got money for land acquisition in that $10 million. The ultimate owner is, but what I think you have to have a letter of intent and say this landowner and this parcel has agreed that they would potentially just, that they've agreed that they would dispose it for this purpose.
At fair market value.
Yeah, it's going to have to be an appraised fair market based on an appraisal and fair market value. And that would have, and we'll have our legal staff, provide that template if we need to. Josh, that's something we could do, couldn't we?
Yeah, sure, Mr. Chairman, I think we'd definitely look into that, see what, is already out there as far as some of the existing things that, our state construction department does. And things
That
like
would be my guess. And so we could actually include that as an addendum if you intend to acquire, that there's a uniform piece in your application that says, here's the agreement that we have with the landowner based on fair market value that this land would be sold upon that appraisal to the entity that's going to acquire that for the purposes. But I think we should provide that template. We already have to know that going forward.
Game and Fish,
go
Parks, do you guys have a process for such things with land acquisition?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. As far as a lined out process, we work through it. We don't necessarily have a template because everyone is so different. But an agreement of some sort in place is probably going to be critical.
Do you have anybody on Zoom with a hand up? Okay.
No, sir,
Please
we don't.
state your name and tell us what you want us to hear.
My name is Leanne Ryder, and my question is, if we are able to find state-owned land where we would like to set this complex, how would the lease for state-owned land be handled?
So I have actually done a little bit of research in that, and so there's really two options. One of them is to acquire the land from the state of Wyoming. The other one would be to enter into a lease. And keep in mind, there's already existing leases, not on all parcels, but many parcels. And so one of the things that we've looked at is the question is how would one lease compare to another? Ultimately, what we'd probably like to do is, because these are school trust lands for the most parts, a few other institutional lands, is actually acquire those. That would be a recommendation to do that. That's a little bit different process. But that would make a recommendation to the governor that we acquire these state lands for this purposes. The other thing would be just to acquire a lease. Most of them are grazing leases. It's not an uncompatible use. It's just a season of use and timing. You know, right before hunting season is not a good time to turn out the cows on the 2,000-yard shooting range. It's probably a bad idea. I mean, you could, but don't call me. No. So that would have to be arranged, but identify that in the parcel up front. And it would be also beneficial. And I think this gets back to the land, the detailed stuff. If you're identifying state lands, I would certainly hope that you've had some contact and communications with the existing leasee, having been through a number of issues where things like that didn't happen. It's that local entity's responsibility to go out there, because what we don't want to do is end up before the state land board with a recommendation that this community acquires this state lease for, or we want to purchase that. And then they have to be the arbitrator between a really pissed off leasee. That's a local issue that you guys need to resolve. So if you in fact are going to do that, so there's two options: lease it. They can maintain their grazing agricultural lease. It'll change the season of use, timing of use, amount of use. Obviously, you're not going to have cows around the parking lot. And so there would probably be some reductions in potential AUMs, but it is feasible to do either one, either to acquire. Long-term, we would probably just want to acquire those state lands, but it could be a long-term lease also.
Second question.
Does that answer your question?
Mostly.
Mostly.
So timing, if you were to enter the RFP process with the local conversations having been held, would you also need to have the state lease portion discussed and squared away ahead of time, or is that something that could happen after the RFP has been submitted?
I don't know the answer to that question, but I know the person that can.
Okay.
So we will contact the Office of State Lands and Investment and have that discussion with the director and maybe even the SLIB board prior to the deadline for submissions of RFPs.
Thank you.
We will have that answer for you. I can do that.
Appreciate that. Thank you.
We might need it by the start date of the RFPs.
Yes,
Yeah.
the start date.
Yeah. Others?
Yeah, Scott Weber from Cody again. I meant the first time I talked to welcome all of you here to Cody, home of the world's largest display gun collection. And we have 5 major firearms manufacturing facilities here. A lot of people don't know that, Cody. I'm Scott Weber. I own Gun Runner Fine Firearms and Auction Company. I got to tell you something. I see a huge problem here. I don't know why this hasn't been addressed. I do not think that any applicant could choose any land and submit any land if they don't know what disciplines will be on it. Okay, each one of you, I know I do, have a pet project, a pet discipline, shooting discipline. Maybe Judy wants to have, 100 to 600 yard military targets. Maybe Aaron wants a 2-mile range and everything up to it. We know this truism of any range, and it's very true of the Cody shooting complex. Clay targets are where the money is. All right, if you have a lot of if you have a lot of traps, you're gonna make a ton of money. What makes us a lot of money is sporting clays. All right, now by definition, sporting clays require what? Terrain. On the sporting here at Cody, we throw targets from the top of mountains and cliffs and gullies and trees. So we never, I mean, I've watched all these Zooms and not once do I see a list of the disciplines that might occur there. That determines what land you're going to submit. So let's say somebody comes all the way through and they got a beautiful destination city. Oh, it's amenities, airport, hotels, restaurants. We get all the way to the end and then the land doesn't fit the disciplines that we want. The architect doesn't select the disciplines, you do, or the winner does. I don't know who does that. So a 2-mile range, imagine the buffering you have to have for a 2-mile range. So somebody has, we would never be able to do that on the Cody Shooting Complex. We're only 480 acres, but you're calling for 2,000. That land may not support a 2-mile range and you have to have it. You see what I'm saying? It might, let's say you think you want 4 sporting clay. You want to be a major entry in that. Let's say you want 4 of them. Well, we've got 2 on the side of a mountain that's just freaking beautiful, world class. So we have to know exactly what we want. I'm big on Olympic shooting. That's what I compete in is Olympic bunkers. That's what we need in this facility. So I'm saying to you that it's like I'm going into a restaurant and they go, okay, order. What's the menu? I don't have a menu.
Mr. Chairman, Scott.
Mm-hmm.
So to address some of your concerns, have you had an opportunity to review the letter of interest that we have out there now for people to look at?
Yes.
So it talks about topography, acres, backstop orientation of the land, buffer zones, zoning issues. This is just saying you need to start the very thing that you're talking about. Start looking at this because when we get the RFP, it's going to all this detailed information that you're talking about. I mean, from access to number of bays, that's part of the whole thing. And so early on, we did a public survey. The very first thing we did was to get back and say, what do we need to include in these? And I don't remember how. It's an extensive list that we were provided. One of the things that I've talked to the co-chair about is we're probably going to do a minor modification to the appropriations to hire a consultant to do, somebody that does this to actually, once we start narrowing it down. But I think we've tried to say already, here's the things you need to start looking at, orientation, topography, distance, all of these issues with the land. The RFP is going to go into a much more detailed saying to get to the very issue that you are. I anticipate most of that, if not all of it's going to be in the RFP, getting back to the soils and the access and orientation and all of that information. So it's contemplated, but if you got a list, I'd be more than happy if you can put that list together. We can incorporate that in and provide that. If you'll send that to us,
okay, I
will guarantee you that we're going to probably incorporate almost everything in there, unless it's already duplicate within the RFP. So
yes.
Is that, and the first question I asked, if you looked at the letter of interest?
Yes.
Because it was trying to tell people, these are the things that we're going to be looking for. That letter, what you have is going to be very helpful.
So you would say that we'd have to have a minimum of 2,000 acres and it would have to have varying topography. Is that a safe bet? I mean, if we put out there 2,000 acres of flat salt sage,
it didn't fly.
We're not gonna win.
No, it says you have to have a description of the topography and the vegetation on the site.
Okay, very good.
So
You want me to read what I think you'll get for 10 million or? just send it to you?
No, because that's pure speculation at this point in time, and
Okay.
we don't even know what the final budget's gonna look like.
Right. See, here's another thing we don't understand is if you have $10 million, is there more than 10 million available? Let me give a scenario. Let's say we find a 2,000 acre deeded ranch and the guy wants 6.5 million for it. That wouldn't leave us enough to have but about 8 traps. So is there, I would imagine that most of the applicants are trying to find state or federal land to submit, I would think, because it's cost prohibitive for 2,000 acres, I would think, with bearing terrain.
So let me,
Go ahead.
I'm confused on that.
okay. So we're gonna see what the communities come up with. And if all the proposals come back and say 2,000 yard shooting range ain't happening. Okay, that's a possibility. They say our proposal is the most we can offer you is 1,000 yard range. Okay, and if that's what every proposal we get gives us, then we're probably going to be stuck with that, right? Ideally, we want 2,000, right? Ideally, we want 4 sporting clays, right? But we're going to see what people offer us, what's out there, and we're going to then have our experts tell us what's the best use of the land you have available. And so you may have a little less in one discipline than might be ideal, but you have a wow factor on another discipline that may seem to offset that. So, you know, we want maximum flexibility. Of course, it would be nice to have but then we're trying to decide, you know, the range configuration for a piece of land we haven't seen yet, right? So you give us rolling topography, you give us varying topography, you give us a certain number of acres, you give us a reasonable buffer zone, and then the experts will come in and probably give us a better idea of what works best. And they may say, well, you've got some choices to make. We can put a 2,000 acre or a 2,000 yard rifle range on there for your long range rifle shooting, but it might preclude that 3rd or 4th sporting clays. So now we have to choose, do we want one over the other? Aaron?
Mr. Chairman, aren't we really looking for, in these submissions, a business plan? I mean, isn't this kind of like Shark Tank and we're the guy sitting back here and they're basically going to pitch and say, hey, look, we've really thought this through. We've done our research. We've looked at the current state of the competitive situation. We've looked at how to monetize this place, how we're going to bring people in, the best numbers, the best revenue. This is what we think is going to work really well. Here's a property that will satisfy this business model. And isn't that kind of how we've set this up? Is we're actually looking for people to do their own research and their own engagement and their own proposal for how it will be successful. And like I'm thinking in terms of a business, do we have to spend $6.5 million in cash to buy the land? Can we finance it? Can the payment and acquisition of that land be part of the operating budget? I mean, I'm just thinking out loud of how does this work? It's like, what if somebody makes a pitch and says, hey, look, we think we can finance $20 million. You guys pitch in your 10, we're going to have 30. Here's the plan that we put together that's going to, you know, run that operations, pay for it. It's like, wouldn't something like that be in the realm of possibility?
I think from day one, the good co-chairman is saying we want maximum flexibility here. We want creativity on the parts of the communities to come to us and say, this is what we got. This is how we think it works out. This is how we think it fulfills the needs for multidisciplinary shooting sports to be co-located or close by. So I think I hadn't thought of it in terms of a business model, but I think you're saying, you know, we want these communities to give us a pitch. You want a world-class shooting facility. This is what we think you could do here without going forward to the point where you're spending the money, having engineers come out and say, well, you know, if we did this type of land work, we could make this work. And so we don't want you to go through all that expense, but say, we got this beautiful piece of property. It's big, it's got some buffer zone, nobody's developing around it. And we think you can put in one super fine sporting shoot facility here.
So you want the applicants then to say what disciplines would fit best in, they speculate that it would fit best in that area?
I think what we said is we want more is better in terms of the different disciplines. We would, but whatever we have there, we want to be world class. So if we're gonna have world class sporting clays, what does that require? We want world class long range rifle. What does that require? We want world class multi-gun facility. What does that require? And we'll have the engineers do the detail work of how to wedge in how many shooting bays to get the maximum use out of that facility and so forth.
One of the things that I think is lacking too, I mean, you've all done great work, but I think every range has its philosophy. Now, what is the philosophy of this range? That would help the applicants tremendously. So we're affiliated with Wyoming Game and Fish. Let me think about Cameo down there in Grand Junction. They have a mountain. They have like a side of a mountain with targets anywhere from like 200 to 640, and their gongs like partially obstructed by brush, or they have bunkers already. So see, when someone comes to it, they get a hunting experience. There may not be a competitive shooter. I see this range as our love letter to the new generation. Everybody in this room has more campfires behind them than ahead of them. We're building this for the next generation. So Game and Fish can put on their website, hunter safety, come to this range for classes, or you can go there and shoot the hunting course or whatever, not just 200-yard paper targets. So I'm looking for that the psychology really of the makeup of what we want to do with this range. And I think the applicant should know that beforehand. It'll help them select land as well as support facilities. So I certainly see it as not, I think of Cameo again. They got sporting clays for competition on one side of the mountain. The other, they've got 22 pistol bays for bullseye or whatever they want to do. Then they got stuff for IDPA and 3-gun. Okay, where are we there? I kind of see us as something to help get young people, women, and everybody into the sports. But I also, a lot of you are talking about competition. Some of you are talking about 2-mile ranges. That's not what the shooting complex has to become more defined, I think, for the applicants. You see where I'm coming from there?
Yeah, so Scott, the very first thing we did after the first organizational meeting is we went to Cameo.
Went to where?
Cameo.
Right.
And we put out to every one of the applicants, it's on the website. We went through and we looked at, I don't know, staff can help, but 6 or 7, anywhere from Florida, Georgia, Ben Avery, Whittington Center, all of these. One of the things that we've had a hard time grappling with, that I have, with the local questions. From when I mean local, I mean the entire state of Wyoming. Every community thinks they have a world-class shooting facility already, and they do not. And it's to change the scope, right? To get to the things that you want. So we know what the bar is. It's the Whittington and the Cameos, and that's what we're trying to emulate here. So, or one up, even better.
And I'd say better. I'd say more disciplines. There are only 2 or 3. They have sporting clays, 5-stand, rifle, pistol.
Yeah, but so.
And they have archery.
One of the things we've already encouraged, every potential applicant, please, at the very minimum, get online and look at all of these facilities. There's a list of them. And they talk about what ones are specialized and how many bays and all of this stuff. We've been working with the NEFI and the National Sporting Foundation. One of the things, once we've got what we think is the parcel of land, it's exactly what the co-chair said. We'll figure out how to squeeze the most out of that parcel of land. And we know, I don't know, and I don't think the committee, maybe some people here know exactly what different disciplines, but we do know the people who do know. And they're the ones that represent those organizations. And that's a role that we've asked the DeFi and the National Sporting Foundation. How many bays do you need for this type of competition?
Right.
How many, what kind of targets and all that stuff? At this point in time, I don't think, I mean, if the local communities have that level of expertise, but I think you're going to spend a lot of time designing a facility you don't even know if you're going to get there. We know we need space, we need hillsides, mountains, topography, we need Wi-Fi, we need water and sewer, we need access, we need camping spots, we need motel space, we need airport, we need all of this infrastructure. We get to that, narrow that down, then we're going to get there. But I want to answer your first question about the $6.5 million property, and is that it? And what's the purpose? And the purpose of this is to create a facility that anybody in the state of Wyoming has access to, but then also has the ability to draw in significant levels of economic activity associated with the facility from not only just in-state, within the region and the nation, and even potentially internationally. Because when we went to Cameo, they told us they had one event where they had 23 states and 5 countries participate. That's what this is designed to do, is to provide something for anybody in the state of Wyoming, but to really draw. So that gets them to the second part of your question. How do you finance that stuff? So if this facility would locate itself in a point that lends itself to become an incubator for other economic activity, manufacturing, retail, again, going down and visiting with this stuff, potential restaurants, so what we want to use this to attract not only just shooters, but manufacturers and retailers. And if the facility and the land will do that, that's what we want to do. I mean, but it's really, when we looked at the economic impact of these things around, government's not going to make money off this. Let's just be upfront. We hope that we can pay for the self with the revenues that it generates. The community and the state will make money off this thing. That is that was, I think, very first meeting that we had was just trying, I don't remember who it was. I actually think it may have been Aaron or Kay that says, what's your objectives? And really that's what it is. And what we also anticipate is a potential for a build out. So obviously this isn't going to happen all in one appropriation, but other sources of money.
Yes,
So-
lots of ranges have vendor rows. Camp Perry, has the Grand American. You can have a shotgun made there while you shoot.
So
I think
you
there will
just
also
described
be,
it.
there also will be the likelihood that we said, well, the site selection is not in the committee's work, then we're going to be hiring the consultants and so forth. But there will probably be compromises that one site that's selected potentially may not be ideal for all the archery stuff that we want, or may not be ideal for whatever. And so there may be compromises that we have to make, that given this site, because it's got all the other things that we think are really important, we're going to have to forego something or have something on a lesser scale that may not attract, national competition for that discipline. Aaron?
Mr. Chairman, I just looked up some notes from our visit to Cameo, which, by the way, I think is an excellent facility. Like, we could do a lot of good with a facility that was of that class. Great, let's make it better. But if we could achieve that, I think in Wyoming, we would be very successful. They only have spent $7 million to acquire the land and the first $5 million of development spend. So just to put it in perspective, so add 20% for inflation, we're still inside of a $10 million budget.
And the importance there is gets to these points about access and utilities, because they didn't have to run water, sewer, and electricity for 15 miles to a site, right? And so the more of those kinds of expenses that you put into your project, the less money you have available for range development. And so that's why we included those kinds of details in our letters of interest.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. And one thing with that too is because you can see the frustration. I'm just going like, okay, you know, how can this work? It was a community endeavor to present the best that your area can do. So the town of Palisade, which is a small little burg, they purchased that property for $4 million. So the community, because they saw how many people it was going to bring in and what it was going to do for the local economy and how much it could grow, they did that with their own projections of economic development. So the community had that as well in theirs. So it wasn't like, how much is the state going to give us? And so what can we do? This is picking the best place in Wyoming to build this facility for all kinds of reasons. I mean, they had, they're in stage 2, where they're building a place to have events. So there was stages going there and getting things set up and how much community involvement and how many organizations. All of that is part of this package, not tell us how much money we can get so that we can figure out how to spend it. That's not the end goal, at least not in my mind. And so take some of the stress off and just say, what can we do? And I know everybody wants it in your community because it's going to be awesome. But what can your community do? And then how can we support the state in everything that's coming in? Because we will be the Amendment 2 state. You all know that. And so let's just look at your county commissions, your city councils, your districts, whatever it might be, and say, what can we as a community present for this project? Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman, to wrap this up real quick and we'll go to Judy, but you know, the other type, and you talked about it, you want the side of a mountain. So this is not something you're going to build houses on, right? So we're talking really some of the acquisition we're looking at. We're not picking the subdivision type of stuff. So cost per acre is probably not going to be these astronomical numbers that you're talking about. Exactly the description you said. We want a very canyon, side of a mountain, those type of things. So the other point is if this thing starts to come, and this is going to fall back on the communities with the vision of potential economic development, there's a number of programs out there. The business model. You may end up with a proposal where you have a significant interest by the private sector that's willing to finance it. Some counties, some municipalities already have land. Your proposal would say, look, we're going to provide, you know, $1 million worth of land at at the current market value. That's our contribution. So it's not limited to just this budget. It's your ability to take this thing, work with your economic development people, your county planners and your city planners, and say, how can we take this and turn it into something a lot bigger than just a shooting range? But there is other opportunities out there, I think, to help finance this thing. I can tell you, I'll be very disappointed if we end up with a $10 million facility. And I think we failed.
That's what we've been wanting to hear. Now that mystery's solved.
Senator Cole.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I think what would be helpful, because these kind of questions keep on emerging over and over again. If anybody wishes to know what had happened in the past, go back and look at the YouTube videos, go back and review them, go through all of them. And I think a lot of these questions will be answered because they've come up in numerous different ways, but they're the same question. So I'd just like to recommend that for people to get a gist of what has happened in the past.
Somebody over here, Lugerski, is that Ms. Lugerski?
I just wanted to correct one misassumption that Mr. Weber had made. The Talladega Range generates 60% of its income from high power long range rifle. It does not generate most of its income from shotgun, as most other ranges do. And that mostly because of electronic targets.
So, thank you. Representative Newsom, I know you have a comment, but also, do we have a timeline for activity?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, we'll plan on lunch. We have box lunches here. We'll grab those and we'll head over to the Cody Firearms Experience. We have a van to take us there. So we can all just grab a lunch and load up in the van. My comment is, as chairman of TRW on the House side, that we would be happy to take this as an interim topic, not to belabor it over the interim, but to be able to make assure that we get a bill and we'll sponsor it by TRW, no matter the decision of the committee.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
James Klessens with Forward. Cody, again, I have a long list, I had a long speech written. I'm not going to do that now, but I just want to say this is a very critical juncture in your process is getting this ironed out so that we are comfortable with what we're proposing to do. I think to answer your question, co-chairman, I think your timeline is perfect. I think that giving more time for the RFP to be done, there are not all communities in Wyoming that have people that are professionals in project development doing the projects for them. And so it affords them an opportunity to do so. I think it would be important though, because the critical piece that you've mentioned a couple of times is if the site isn't suitable, most of the communities don't have people there that could tell you that definitively. You indicated things like water table, site, soil suitability and such. I wonder if maybe part of the process would be to look in advance to the team that's going to design the site and make a cursory review of the site by that design professional, part of that review, because it would be a terrible thing to go that far down the road and make a selection and then realize, oops. So perhaps that might be something that that you take and think. I really appreciate the fact that every community in this state, because we know we have some gem communities in the state, have an opportunity to be a part of this process, and appreciate the fact that you're keeping them in it as long as you possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you. Others in the room wanting to comment on this? Anybody on Zoom? Oh, one more, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, Joel Highsmith, Fremont County Association of Government. Thanks for this opportunity to speak. Co-chairs and the rest of the committee. I just wanted to make a small comment that I found very interesting with recent discussions. The Whittington Center's management's been a little reluctant to maybe work with us. They sort of listen what's getting said up here. They've actually said that they're looking at us as a competitor of the Whittington Center. That's, I guess, a compliment, trying to get some more information to help our process, but that comment was made. So what has been created here and what you're working on, you're talking world class, and it's getting world class, one of the world class, if not the world class attention. So, we're going to keep on trying to do the good work and thank all of you. That's all.
Thank you. My sense is there's plenty of shooting sports to go around, and we can all benefit from this endeavor. All right, committee, we have a lunch activity, and then I would like to have us reconvene here after lunch and make sure we're comfortable with where we're leaving before we depart today. So Representative Newsom has lined up an event for us over the lunch hour. We'll take their shuttle and then we'll reconvene here. Representative Newsom, what time do you think we'll be back? 6? I like the way you think, huh? So we'll reconvene at 2:00. Reconvene at 2:00. And with that, we'll be stand at ease.